Sherlock Holmes and the Adventure of the Whispering Tomb, from the Reminiscences of John H. Watson, M.D., by Arthur Conan Doyle, in style. Chapter 1, The Groundskeeper's Tale. It was on a particularly gloomy morning in early November when I received an unexpected visit from my old friend Sherlock Holmes. The air was thick with the damp of autumn, and the fog rolled lazily through the streets of London, giving the city an air of mystery that matched Holmes's enigmatic presence. I had been sitting in my study, reviewing some notes from my recent medical practice, when I heard a firm knock at the door. I looked up, recognizing the familiar rhythm of the knock. It was Sherlock, undoubtedly with some curious case that demanded his unerring logic. I rose, my curiosity piqued, and opened the door. "Watson, my dear fellow!" Holmes exclaimed, stepping into the room with his usual briskness. His dark eyes, sharp as a hawk's, gleamed with excitement as he removed his hat and overcoat. "I trust you are well?" "No time for pleasantries. There's work to be done." I returned his smile, though I could not help but notice the urgency in his voice. "I'm well enough, Holmes, but what brings you here so early in the day? I assume this is more than a social visit?" Holmes gave a small nod, his eyes never leaving me. "Indeed, Watson. I've received word of a peculiar incident from the outskirts of the city, a graveyard, to be exact, a place of forgotten memories and untold stories. The groundskeeper there, a man by the name of Avery, has reported some rather disturbing occurrences." I raised an eyebrow, setting down my pen. "Disturbing occurrences? In a graveyard?" "Precisely," Holmes said, lowering his voice slightly. "He claims that he's heard voices emanating from a sealed tomb. Voices that speak as though there are people trapped inside. There have been whispers of light flickering through the cracks in the tomb's stone door, and even the sound of footsteps echoing through the crypt at night. The locals, of course, are convinced it is a haunting." I leaned forward in my chair, intrigued. "A haunting? Surely you don't believe in such superstitions, Holmes." Holmes's lips curled slightly at the corners. "You misunderstand me, Watson. I do not put stock in the supernatural. However, I do put stock in human behavior, and I have no doubt that this is a case of earthly deception. Our task is to uncover the truth behind these strange occurrences and determine who or what is responsible." I stood, eager for the adventure ahead. "Well then, Holmes, shall we investigate?" He gave a swift nod, his eyes alight with determination. "Indeed, Watson, let us see what secrets the tomb holds." The fog was thick as we made our way through the winding streets of London, the fog creeping through the alleys and clinging to the cobblestones beneath our feet. The air was damp and cold, but Holmes, always purposeful, walked with an energy that seemed to defy the weather. We took a carriage to the outskirts of the city, where the land began to open up into green fields dotted with small cottages and meadows. As we arrived at the cemetery, I could not help but notice how still the place was. The tall iron gates that marked the entrance were weathered and rusted, the hinges squealing as they swung open. Beyond the gates, a narrow path led into the cemetery, where rows of leaning headstones stood like forgotten soldiers in a long-forgotten battle. Holmes led the way, his eyes scanning the surroundings with the precision of a hawk. The ground was soft beneath our boots, and the air smelled of damp earth and the faint scent of decay. The place felt ancient, untouched by time, yet forgotten by the world. At the far side of the cemetery stood the crypt, its stone facade crumbling and covered in ivy. The wrought iron gates that sealed the tomb were rusted and locked, but there were signs of recent activity. Footprints in the dirt, a faint smell of burning incense. The graveyard had an eerie stillness about it, as though the very ground held its breath, waiting for something to happen. A man stood near the crypt, looking out of place in the desolate surroundings. He was thin and hunched, wearing a long coat that was frayed at the edges. His face was pale, and his eyes darted nervously as he noticed our approach. This, I assumed, was Avery, the groundskeeper. "Mr. Holmes? Dr. Watson?" he called, his voice low and trembling. "Thank you for coming." Holmes nodded in acknowledgement, his gaze never leaving the crypt. "You've reported strange occurrences at this tomb, Mr. Avery. Tell me exactly what you've heard." Avery took a deep breath, his hands wringing nervously. "It began a week ago, sir," he said in a hushed voice. At first, it was just whispers, soft voices, as though someone was speaking from inside the crypt. Then I began to hear footsteps, like someone pacing within the tomb. But the worst part was last night. I saw a flicker of light through the cracks in the stone, like a candle burning inside. But when I checked, the tomb was sealed. There was no one there. Holmes tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing as he took in the groundskeeper's words. "And you're certain no one has entered the tomb? No one has broken in?" Avery shook his head fervently. "No, sir. The tomb has been sealed for over a century. It's the final resting place of Lord Ravenscar's family. After the fire that destroyed his estate, the tomb was sealed, and no one has entered it since." Holmes's brow furrowed slightly. "A fire, you say? Tell me more about this fire." Avery swallowed hard, clearly uncomfortable with the topic. "It was a terrible disaster, sir. Ravenscar Manor was one of the grandest estates in the country, but it was destroyed in a fire many years ago. The fire claimed the lives of Lord Ravenscar's wife and children, but the son, he was seen running from the manor on that very night, though his face was burned beyond recognition. After that, no one heard from him again. They say he perished in the flames, but there was never any proof." Holmes turned away from the crypt, his sharp gaze returning to Avery. "And you believe these strange occurrences are linked to this missing man? The son of Lord Ravenscar?" Avery nodded, his face pale with fear. "The villagers speak of whispers on the wind. Some say it's the spirit of Lord Ravenscar's son, trapped in the crypt. They say he's trying to communicate, to tell us what happened that night." Holmes looked at me, his eyes glinting with interest. "I believe, Watson, that we've only scratched the surface. Let us investigate further. The truth, as always, lies beneath." And so, with our curiosity piqued and the eerie atmosphere of the cemetery hanging heavily around us, we began our investigation into the mystery of the Whispering Tomb. Holmes's sharp eyes seemed to pierce the gloom surrounding the crypt as he stepped closer to the wrought iron gates. The tomb itself was nestled against a small rise, surrounded by overgrown ivy and thick clusters of ancient trees that loomed like silent sentinels. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the very earth had absorbed secrets it was reluctant to relinquish. The whispers in the wind seemed to echo against the gravestones. Whether they were the sounds of nature or something far more sinister, I could not tell. Avery, still nervous, fidgeted with the brim of his cap, his eyes flicking nervously toward the tomb, as though he half expected something to materialize from within the stone walls. Holmes, however, stood still, his expression calculating as he examined the structure with meticulous care. The ivy climbing the crypt's walls was thick, but it had been untouched in years. There was no sign of any recent disturbance. "Well, Mr. Avery," Holmes said, turning to face the groundskeeper after a moment's pause, "you claim that you've witnessed light flickering within this tomb. I must ask, did you see this light on more than one occasion, or was it merely a fleeting moment?" Avery shook his head again, wringing his hands as he stammered. "No, sir. Not fleeting at all. It lasted for several minutes. I thought, perhaps, it was just my imagination. But the next day, I saw the flicker again. I'm certain it came from within." Holmes's gaze swept over the crypt once more, the wheels in his mind turning. "Did you make any attempts to investigate further? Perhaps by examining the tomb's seals or looking for any signs of tampering?" Avery shifted uncomfortably, his face contorting with embarrassment. "I did, sir. Last night I went to check. Under cover of darkness, mind you. I didn't want to be seen by anyone for fear they'd think I was, imagining things. But when I arrived, the door was still sealed tight, the cracks barely wide enough for a hand to slip through, let alone anything larger." Holmes nodded, his brow furrowing thoughtfully. "Very well, Avery. Thank you for your honesty. I trust that you have not been deceived by external factors, such as reflections or light from nearby sources?" "No, sir," Avery replied with a hint of frustration in his voice. "The nearest buildings are some distance away. Nothing could have caused the light to shine through the tomb's stone. I know what I saw." Holmes seemed to consider this for a moment, his eyes narrowing as he approached the crypt's stone door, his hands carefully tracing its surface. He gently ran his fingers along the edges of the iron gates, testing for any sign of looseness or recent manipulation. There was nothing. No marks, no obvious breaches. The stone appeared weathered, its surface worn by years of exposure to the elements, but there was no evidence that anyone had attempted to break in. Holmes stood back, his eyes scanning the perimeter of the crypt once again, as though he were searching for some unseen clue. "Watson," Holmes said suddenly, his voice sharp and commanding, "I believe we should have a closer look at the tomb's interior. You should not be deceived by the sealed nature of this crypt. We may find that the answers we seek lie within." I nodded, eager to assist. "Shall we attempt to force the door open?" "No need," Holmes replied, the faintest hint of a smile curling at his lips. "We shall simply make use of the keys. Avery," he added, turning toward the groundskeeper, "I presume you have access to a set of keys for this tomb?" Avery hesitated for a moment, before nodding slowly. "Yes, sir. The keys are kept in the caretaker's lodge, along with the ones for the other grave sites in the cemetery. They've been in my care for many years." "Then let us proceed, Mr. Avery," Holmes said, his voice tinged with quiet authority. "We must see the tomb from within." Avery, still looking quite nervous, led us toward a small stone cottage at the edge of the graveyard. The caretaker's lodge was a humble affair, built with the same crumbling stone as the surrounding cemetery, its windows dark and its door slightly ajar. Inside, the smell of dust and old wood filled the air, and the faint crackle of a dying fire in the hearth added to the eerie atmosphere. Avery moved quickly to a small wooden cabinet by the wall, unlocking it with a key from his pocket. Inside were several iron keys, each hanging on its own rusty hook. He selected one with a swift motion, holding it out toward Holmes. "This is the one, sir," he said. "The key to the Ravenscar crypt." Holmes took the key from Avery's hand, turning it over in his fingers with practiced ease. "I shall need a lantern, Watson," he said, his tone still calm, though there was an unmistakable gleam of determination in his eyes. "I trust you have one with you?" "Of course, Holmes," I replied, producing a lantern from my bag. I lit it, the soft glow casting long shadows across the room. Together, we retraced our steps toward the crypt, Avery following closely behind. The thick fog had begun to lift slightly, but the chill in the air remained as persistent as ever. Holmes, unbothered by the damp, made his way directly to the door of the tomb, his fingers adjusting the key in the lock with the precision of a master locksmith. The lock clicked, and slowly, the heavy iron door creaked open. The interior of the tomb was dark, the light from our lantern barely illuminating the stone walls. The air inside was stale, heavy with the scent of age and decay. Holmes stepped forward first, his eyes scanning every inch of the space. The crypt was much larger than I had imagined, with rows of stone niches lining the walls, each one bearing the engraved name of a Ravenscar ancestor. The floor was covered in dust, save for a few footprints that led to the far side of the room, where an altar-like stone table stood. Above it was a large plaque bearing the inscription, "Here lies Lord Reginald Ravenscar, eldest son of the Ravenscar line, died in the fire of 1837. Holmes's gaze settled on the plaque for only a moment before he turned his attention to the far corner, where a large sarcophagus lay, its lid half ajar. "Interesting," Holmes murmured, his voice low and deliberate. "Very interesting indeed." I stepped forward to join him, and as I did, I noticed something odd. There were faint marks on the floor, marks that looked as if something heavy had been dragged across the stone. The path of these marks led directly to the sarcophagus. My curiosity piqued. I followed Holmes as he crouched beside it, his hand gently brushing the edge of the half-open lid. "This sarcophagus," Holmes said, his voice laced with quiet intensity, "has been disturbed recently. It appears that someone or something has been inside." A chill ran down my spine. But if the tomb has been sealed for years, who could have? Holmes rose, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "That, Watson, is exactly what we must discover. I suspect that we are dealing with something far more elaborate than a simple haunting. There are hidden motives at play here, and it is my belief that they lie beneath the very stone upon which we stand." As he stepped back from the sarcophagus, his keen gaze scanning every corner of the room, I couldn't help but wonder what secrets were buried within the crypt's walls, and what lengths someone had gone to in order to keep them hidden. "Let us proceed with caution, Watson," Holmes said, his voice sharp and filled with a rare urgency. "This mystery is far from solved, and we have only begun to uncover the layers of deception that have been carefully constructed here." And so, we continued our investigation, determined to unearth the truth that lay beneath the whispering tomb. Chapter 2: The Shadow Beneath the Tombstone. The next morning found Holmes and I on our way to the village of Ravenscar, a small and rather isolated hamlet nestled on the edge of the moors. The fog that had gripped the cemetery the previous night had dissipated by dawn, though the sky remained a dull gray, hinting at a chill that would settle over the land as the day went on. As we made our way through the village, Holmes seemed unusually pensive, his sharp eyes scanning the countryside with the same intensity that he had reserved for the crypt the previous evening. We had decided to speak with the local authorities in an attempt to gather more information about Lord Reginald Ravenscar, the nobleman whose tomb we had discovered to be the focal point of the strange occurrences. Avery, the groundskeeper, had mentioned that the Ravenscar estate had been thought lost in a fire many years ago, but Holmes had other thoughts on the matter. There were pieces of the puzzle still missing, and Holmes was determined to uncover them. As we approached the village square, the unmistakable scent of freshly baked bread and the clatter of farm carts filled the air. The square was a picturesque scene: stone cottages with thatched roofs, the occasional horse-drawn cart laden with vegetables and livestock, and villagers who went about their day with a quiet, almost solemn rhythm. However, there was an undercurrent of unease in the air, something that was more felt than seen. People moved with a sort of deliberate avoidance, their gazes lowered as we passed by. A subtle tension clung to the atmosphere, and I could not help but feel the weight of the centuries of history that had settled over this place like a heavy cloak. Holmes and I made our way to the modest police station, a small stone building that stood at the far end of the village square. Inside, the walls were adorned with maps and weathered documents, and the air was thick with the scent of tobacco smoke and the faint rustle of paperwork. The local constable, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Thomas Gray, stood behind a desk cluttered with papers. He looked up as we entered, his expression one of mild surprise. Holmes wasted no time in introducing himself. "Constable Gray, I am Sherlock Holmes, and this is my colleague, Dr. John Watson," Holmes began. "We are investigating a matter regarding the Ravenscar tomb. It seems there is something quite unusual taking place there, and we require your assistance in uncovering the truth." Gray blinked, then frowned. "The Ravenscar tomb, you say?" "I must admit, Mr. Holmes, that's a subject I don't much care to talk about. There's been talk of ghosts and curses for years, and it's only brought trouble to our village. But if you're here to investigate, I'll do my best to assist you." Holmes nodded, his expression unreadable. "We are not concerned with ghosts, Constable. We are concerned with the truth, which often takes a more human form. Perhaps you can tell us about the history of the Ravenscar family and what exactly happened to the estate after the fire in 1837. Constable Gray hesitated, his face clouded with thought. The fire was a terrible tragedy. It destroyed the Ravenscar estate, along with most of the family's wealth. Lord Reginald Ravenscar, the head of the family at the time, perished in the flames, or so we were led to believe. Afterward, the estate was left in ruins and the family faded from public memory. The tomb, however, remained, a silent monument to their fall. "And what of the other members of the Ravenscar family?" Holmes pressed. "Were there any survivors? Any other heirs?" Gray's expression darkened. "There were rumors of a younger brother, Sir Edmund Ravenscar, but no one ever confirmed his existence. Some say he disappeared after the fire, others that he went mad. There were no direct heirs, and the estate was left in the hands of distant relatives and financial trustees. But over the years, the Ravenscar name has been all but forgotten." Holmes tapped his fingers on his chin, deep in thought. "Tell me, Constable, have there been any strange occurrences or disturbances near the Ravenscar tomb in recent months? Perhaps things that you might not immediately connect to the supernatural?" Gray shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening around the edge of the desk. "Now that you mention it, there have been odd happenings. Strange lights in the crypt, like you've heard. A few villagers have claimed to hear whispers or the sound of something moving inside, but no one dares to go near the tomb after dark, and we've received no official reports. Just a lot of gossip and rumors." Holmes raised an eyebrow. And you believe these whispers and lights are merely the product of local superstition? Gray met Holmes's gaze steadily. Perhaps. But then again, there's always been something unsettling about that crypt. I can't explain it, but I wouldn't set foot near it myself. Interesting, Holmes murmured. I would like to examine the records you have on the Ravenscar estate. Anything related to the family's finances, wills, or property holdings might be of great use. Certainly, Gray replied. I'll fetch them for you. As the constable stepped away to retrieve the documents, Holmes turned to me. His gaze was fixed, his mind clearly working through the details of our conversation. I suspect, Watson, that the fire was no mere accident, he said quietly. The complete destruction of the estate, the disappearance of the family's wealth, the obscure nature of the surviving relatives. There is more to this than we have been led to believe. The tomb itself, undisturbed for so many years, now becomes the center of a strange activity. And Avery's testimony of seeing light and movement inside it, it is all too coincidental. I nodded, my own thoughts echoing Holmes's sentiments. What do you think this all leads to? Holmes's eyes narrowed with a dangerous glint. I believe someone is hiding something beneath that tombstone, Watson. The question is, who and why? Just then, Constable Gray returned, carrying a large ledger and several other smaller documents. He set them down on the desk before Holmes, who immediately began sifting through them. His fingers moved swiftly over the pages, his eyes scanning each line with practiced precision. Here, Holmes said after a few moments, pausing on a particular page. He held up a document for me to see. This is a record of the Ravenscar family's financial holdings before the fire. It lists several valuable estates and properties, including a sizable collection of art and artifacts. But look at this. There is a discrepancy in the records. I leaned forward, studying the document closely. A discrepancy? What do you mean? Holmes pointed to a small notation at the bottom of the page. There's an entry here about a hidden vault. It was to be opened only upon the death of Lord Reginald's father, but the fire destroyed the vault's location. At least that's what the records suggest. Yet, this information wasn't widely known. Whoever was behind the fire might have been after what was hidden within that vault. So you believe the fire wasn't accidental? I asked. Holmes nodded. Exactly. Someone wanted the Ravenscar fortune, and likely something far more valuable than gold or property. I suspect the vault held something of great significance, something that would explain the activity at the crypt. As Holmes continued to pore over the records, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were on the cusp of uncovering a far deeper mystery than we had initially imagined. And as the constable looked on, his expression betraying nothing, I began to wonder just how many people in Ravenscar were involved in the secrets surrounding the tomb. It was clear that we were not just dealing with a haunted crypt, but with a complex web of greed, deception, and hidden history, and Holmes would stop at nothing to untangle it all. Chapter 3. The Secret of the Vault. The late afternoon was nearing its close when Holmes and I left the small police station with the Ravenscar estate's records in hand. The fog had rolled in again, this time heavier than before, and the pale sun seemed swallowed whole by the shifting mist, casting the village in a ghostly, ethereal light. As we made our way back toward the cemetery, Holmes's silence spoke volumes. He was mulling over the recent discoveries, his mind whirring with the possibilities. I can sense you're on the verge of something, Holmes, I remarked as we walked, keeping pace with him, though my own thoughts were a jumble of questions and theories. Holmes turned his gaze on me, his eyes sharp but thoughtful. I am indeed, Watson. The discrepancy in the estate records has given me a lead I hadn't anticipated. A vault hidden in the Ravenscar estate, and the suggestion that it was destroyed in the fire. It is too neat, too convenient. If something of great significance was hidden there, it would explain why the Ravenscar family's fortune has been lost to history. I raised an eyebrow, intrigued. And the whispers and strange occurrences around the crypt? Do you think it's all tied to this vault? Undoubtedly, Holmes replied. Whoever is behind this charade is deliberately trying to divert attention away from the tombstone of Lord Reginald Ravenscar. I suspect the vault lies beneath it, or rather, that it was designed to be beneath it. Whoever moved quickly enough to seize the Ravenscar fortune might have found it, though why they would leave it hidden for so long is still unclear. The cemetery loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the bleak horizon, and I could see the entrance to the crypt from this distance. A stone structure, plain and severe, shrouded in the creeping tendrils of fog. The villagers had long avoided it, fearful of the curse that supposedly haunted it, but I knew that Holmes was never one to heed superstitions. He only sought the truth beneath the layers of myth. When we reached the crypt, we noticed something we had not before, a faint scuff mark on the stone steps leading down into the tomb. The weathered surface of the steps had borne the marks of countless years, but this one seemed recent, and as Holmes crouched to inspect it, I saw his eyes narrow. "I think we found our first clue," he said, rising and brushing off his trousers. "Scuff marks on a step?" I asked, uncertain. "Yes. Someone has been here recently, and not by the usual route," Holmes replied, motioning for me to follow him inside the crypt. The door was ajar, the rusty hinges creaking softly as we pushed it open. A faint smell of dampness and earth lingered inside, and the air was unnervingly still. We entered and surveyed the interior. The crypt was dark and musty, the faint glow of daylight filtering in from the small cracks in the stone walls. The grand stone slab that marked Lord Reginald's resting place stood in the center of the room, but Holmes's attention was drawn to the far wall, where another, smaller crypt lay, one that hadn't been mentioned in the estate records. "What's this?" I asked, stepping closer to the obscure wall. It appeared to be nothing more than a stone face, its surface chipped and worn, but a faint outline in the mortar suggested a hidden compartment. Holmes wasted no time. He ran his fingers along the stone, his eyes narrowing with concentration. A false wall. It's not part of the original crypt design. This was added much later. Whoever sealed this away wanted to ensure that no one would discover what lies behind it. With a small smile, Holmes retrieved his magnifying glass and inspected the edges of the false wall. I stood by, growing more fascinated by his methodical examination of the tomb's every detail. Holmes had long since demonstrated his ability to find hidden truths in the most inconspicuous of places. "There's a slight difference in the mortar around this seam," Holmes remarked after a few moments. "This wall has been shifted recently, not to conceal anything immediately apparent, but to hide something else entirely." He reached into his coat and produced a small, delicate crowbar. Within moments, he was working at the edge of the wall, prying gently at the stone. It took mere seconds before there was a subtle shift, followed by a sharp crack. Holmes's eyes lit up with satisfaction. "There we are," he said, with the sort of quiet triumph that only he could master. The false wall fell open to reveal a narrow, dark passage leading deeper into the earth. I was startled at the sight. It seemed as though the tomb had a secret corridor, one that could only have been used for highly confidential purposes. "After you, Watson," Holmes said, motioning to me with a slight bow. With a quiet laugh of disbelief, I obeyed, stepping into the dark tunnel. The passage was narrow and smelled faintly of old stone and damp earth. The walls were made of the same cold gray stone as the tomb, but unlike the crypt, there was a peculiar energy in the air, an oppressive sense of secrecy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. We followed the passage for several minutes before it opened into a small, low-ceilinged chamber. The room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of a lantern that hung from the ceiling. At the center of the chamber stood an ornate chest, its surface covered in intricate carvings, and the unmistakable shine of brass fittings glinted in the dim light. The chest was locked, but Holmes's eyes lit up with recognition. "This," he said, his voice quiet but certain, "is what we've been searching for." I moved closer, my curiosity piqued. "What is it? A chest hidden beneath the tomb?" Holmes gave a wry smile. "Not just any chest, Watson. This is the vault, though not in the traditional sense. It was never meant to be a bank for gold or jewels, but something far more valuable." He produced a small key from his pocket, the brass key glinting in the dim light. It fit perfectly into the lock of the chest. Holmes turned the key with a slow, deliberate motion, and the lid creaked open to reveal its contents. Inside was a collection of documents, neatly stacked and bound together with ribbon, along with several small, finely crafted objects. One of these objects caught my eye, A silver ring, engraved with intricate symbols and an inscription I couldn't quite make out. Holmes lifted the ring carefully, inspecting it. "This," he said, "is no ordinary piece of jewelry. It is a family heirloom, a signet ring, to be precise. This belongs to the Ravenscar family. But more than that, it is likely the key to understanding what they were truly protecting." He handed me the ring, and I could feel its weight in my palm, a weight far greater than its size would suggest. "But why hide it in such a place?" I asked. Holmes met my gaze with a knowing smile. "Because, Watson, the truth about the Ravenscar family and their legacy is far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined, and someone is willing to kill to keep it hidden." We both stood there in the gloom of the secret chamber, the flickering lantern casting long shadows on the stone walls. A deep silence filled the room, but the truth was beginning to take shape in my mind. Someone, or something, had gone to great lengths to conceal what lay beneath the tombstone of Lord Reginald Ravenscar, and now we were on the cusp of unraveling a mystery that had been buried for decades. Chapter 4: The Puzzle Unfolds. The silver ring in my hand seemed to hum with a strange energy, its weight heavy with secrets. I turned it over between my fingers, trying to decipher its meaning. The intricate carvings, the faint glimmer of old tarnish, and the symbols that spiraled across its surface were all a mystery. Holmes, ever the observer, stood motionless beside me, his sharp eyes watching my every move with a quiet intensity. "You see, Watson," he said, breaking the silence, "this ring is no mere trinket of noble fashion. Its markings are not decorative, but deeply symbolic. It is a seal, one of great importance to the Ravenscar family and, I suspect, to whatever has been hidden beneath this tomb." I nodded, but my mind raced with questions. But why go to such lengths to conceal something so small? And why bury it here, hidden within this secret chamber beneath the tomb? What does it all mean? Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile, one that spoke of both confidence and curiosity. "That, my dear Watson, is exactly what we are going to find out." We spent the next hour meticulously examining the contents of the chest, with Holmes closely scrutinizing each document and object. The papers were carefully folded and tied, and as Holmes untied them, he revealed several important-looking letters and legal documents. Some were written in a neat, flowing hand, while others were hastily scrawled, as though penned in a moment of great distress. Most were yellowed with age, their ink faded, yet the most intriguing of them was a letter that stood apart from the others. It was addressed to Lord Reginald Ravenscar, though it bore no official seal. The handwriting was elegant, almost delicate, and the contents of the letter sent a chill through my spine as Holmes read it aloud. "My lord, the time has come to act. Your family's legacy is more than a mere matter of wealth. It is a matter of power. Power that could shape the fate of this land and the colonies. The vault is to be secured, and no one but you and those who are truly loyal will know its contents. Our enemies are many, but with this we will have the strength to turn the tide. We must not delay. The fire was but the beginning. Trust no one but those whose names you know by heart." Holmes paused as he finished reading the letter, the meaning of the words settling heavily in the air between us. "The fire," I murmured, piecing the puzzle together. "It was no accident, was it?" Holmes nodded grimly. "No, the fire was set deliberately, but not to destroy the Ravenscar estate. It was a diversion, a means to cover up something far more important. What we are dealing with here, Watson, is not just a simple family treasure or estate dispute. This vault and its contents are tied to something far more dangerous. A network of power, wealth, and rebellion." I swallowed hard, my mind racing to keep up with the deductions Holmes had already made. "Rebellion? What are you suggesting?" Holmes stood up abruptly, pacing as he spoke. "This letter was written by someone with an intimate knowledge of the Ravenscar family's affairs, someone who knew about the vault, about Lord Reginald's secrets. The mention of power, the colonies, and the need for secrecy points to a conspiracy far larger than a mere family matter. Lord Ravenscar, it seems, was involved in something that could threaten the stability of the empire itself." I looked at the letter in Holmes's hand, the faded ink and trembling paper seeming more ominous than ever. But who would have the motive to bury such secrets? And why would they go through such lengths to prevent them from being discovered? Holmes turned to face me, his eyes alight with both the thrill of discovery and the weight of the task ahead. That, Watson, is the question we must answer. And to do so, we must find the one who sent this letter. We must trace this conspiracy to its roots, no matter how far it leads. As we stood in the darkened chamber, the weight of the situation began to settle in. What had once seemed like a simple case of an old family mystery was quickly becoming something far more dangerous, something that could tear at the very fabric of the empire. The fire, the cryptic letter, and now the strange whispers and hauntings surrounding the Ravenscar tomb, it was all part of a much larger plan. Holmes's gaze turned to the silver ring, still resting in my palm. "This ring," he said, "is not merely a symbol of the Ravenscar family. It is a key. The answer lies in its true meaning, and I believe it holds the final clue to understanding what Lord Ravenscar and his conspirators were planning." I looked at the ring again, seeing it with new eyes. The engravings, I now realized, were not merely decorative. They were a cipher, a code that, when deciphered, would reveal the next step in the trail. But what was it that the ring was trying to tell us? "We'll need to consult someone who can help us understand the markings on this ring," I said thoughtfully. "Perhaps someone versed in languages and symbols." Holmes nodded. "Precisely, Watson. I have just the person in mind. We shall pay a visit to a colleague of mine, a linguist and historian by the name of Dr. Evelyn Hartley. She specializes in ancient symbols and forgotten languages. If anyone can shed light on the meanings hidden within this ring, it is she." With our course of action decided, we gathered the contents of the chest and prepared to leave the crypt. Holmes carefully wrapped the documents and ring in a cloth, his mind already working through the possibilities. As we stepped back into the narrow tunnel leading to the tomb entrance, the air grew colder, and the distant sound of the wind howling outside added an eerie undertone to the silence. The path back to the village was long, and the mist had thickened further, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. But Holmes's stride was unyielding, his mind already racing toward the next steps in the investigation. The mystery had deepened, and with it, the danger. We arrived at the small inn where Dr. Hartley resided by twilight, a quiet little establishment nestled at the edge of the village. The door creaked open as we entered, and the smell of burning wood and fresh bread greeted us. Dr. Hartley, a woman in her mid-30s with sharp, intelligent eyes and a mane of dark, unruly hair, looked up from behind a stack of ancient manuscripts as we entered. "Holmes? Watson?" she said, her voice warm but full of curiosity. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Holmes wasted no time in explaining the situation, presenting the silver ring and the letter. Dr. Hartley took the ring with careful hands, turning it over in her fingers as she examined the markings. Her brow furrowed as she inspected the symbols, muttering to herself under her breath. "This," she said, finally looking up at us with a grave expression, "is no ordinary cipher. These symbols belong to a very specific tradition, one that is tied to an ancient order that dates back centuries. It was thought to be lost to history." Holmes leaned in closer, his eyes gleaming with intrigue. "An ancient order? What kind of order?" Dr. Hartley set the ring down on the table, her hands trembling slightly as she spoke. An order that dealt in power, in secrets, and in the very fate of nations. The Ravenscar family was no mere noble house. They were involved in something much darker. And this ring, she paused, her voice dropping to a whisper, is the key to unlocking a web of intrigue that could shake the empire to its core. Holmes's face hardened as he stood straighter. "Then it seems, Dr. Hartley, that our work here is just beginning." And so it was. What had begun as a simple case of a haunted tomb and a family mystery had now unfolded into something far more perilous, a dangerous game of power and secrecy. The stakes were higher than we could have imagined, and with every step, the shadows grew darker. We had unwittingly stepped into a conspiracy that could unravel the very fabric of the empire itself. The question now was not if we could stop it, but how much of it we could uncover before it was too late. As Dr. Hartley carefully placed the silver ring back on the table, her sharp eyes fixed on Holmes, as though she were measuring him for something more than just his usual detective resolve. Her hand lingered over the ring, as if reluctant to release it, a subtle hint of recognition flickering in her expression. "Holmes?" she said, her voice steady but edged with concern. "This is not simply an artifact of old wealth. This ring is an emblem of an ancient society, one with roots so deep in history that its very name has become little more than myth." Holmes did not flinch, though his posture stiffened. "Tell me, Dr. Hartley," he urged, "of which society do you speak?" "The Order of the Black Raven," she replied, her words cutting through the air like a dagger. "A secretive and powerful group, once thought to have disappeared with the fall of ancient kingdoms, but their influence, if only in the shadows, has endured. They dealt in the manipulation of power, true power, beyond wealth or influence. Their work was often subversive, and many believe that they had ties to both the royal courts of Europe and the burgeoning colonial empires." I exchanged a quick glance with Holmes. This was more than I had expected. The mere mention of such a name carried with it a terrible weight, one that implied not only treachery, but a scale of conspiracy that could touch the farthest reaches of the empire. "What was their purpose?" I asked, my voice low as I tried to grasp the full scope of the tale that Dr. Hartley was weaving. Dr. Hartley looked at me then, her eyes steady. "Their goal, I believe, was control, not just of land, but of entire nations. The Ravenscar family was deeply entwined with them. In fact, they were said to be the keepers of a hidden cache, an immense vault buried beneath Ravenscar Hall, containing artifacts and documents that could change the course of history." Holmes's sharp gaze never left Dr. Hartley, but his mind was already racing through 1,000 possibilities. "And this vault is what the fire was meant to conceal?" he asked, his voice steady but with a note of anticipation. "Yes," she confirmed, her voice hardening. "But there is more. The vault's contents were not only intended to protect certain treasures, but also to provide leverage for the group's, how shall I say it, rebellious ambitions. They were said to hold plans, documents, even military strategies that would aid in revolutions within the colonies, specifically in India and the Americas. This was not just treasure. This was the power to reshape empires." I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. The notion that a single family, hidden behind a veil of nobility and secrets, could be the key to an underground network of global conspiracies was both terrifying and enthralling. But Holmes, ever the master of keeping his composure, nodded slowly, as though this revelation was merely another piece in the puzzle. "Then we are dealing with more than just a burglary," Holmes said, his voice low and controlled. "Someone wanted the contents of this vault destroyed, not just stolen. But why the haunting? Why the deception of a supernatural element? Who stands to gain from this charade?" Dr. Hartley's lips pressed together in a thin line, and she set her hands down flat on the table. "That is the question, isn't it? Someone is trying to scare the villagers away from the tomb. And not just scare them. They want to hide the truth, to keep it buried, even if it means using every method of subterfuge and terror they can. But why?" Holmes looked from Dr. Hartley to me, his eyes narrowing in thought. "Fear is a powerful tool, Watson. People will believe what they cannot explain, and in their fear, they become blind. The whispers, the strange noises, the sealed crypt, all of it is designed to create a legend, a myth that will deter anyone from uncovering the truth. It's a cover-up, a distraction from the real story beneath." "But if this is about hiding the vault," I asked, "then why not simply seal it and forget it? Why risk exposure with such theatrics?" Holmes paced across the small study, his long fingers tapping thoughtfully against his chin. "There is a reason, Watson," he said, his eyes gleaming with the fire of insight, "and I believe it lies in the very nature of the vault itself. The vault was designed not just to house treasures, but to be found, or at least, to be known of. For some reason, someone is desperate for this vault's existence to be forgotten, erased from memory." "You think someone is deliberately trying to suppress knowledge of it?" Dr. Hartley asked, clearly intrigued by Holmes's line of thought. "Precisely," Holmes replied. "And in doing so, they are creating a dangerous game, a game where truth and myth blur together until the only thing that remains is a legend, one that no one dares to challenge. But we are not like the villagers. We will not be swayed by whispers in the night." I nodded, though I was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation. The vault was not just a family secret, nor was it simply an object of treasure. It was a symbol of power, of rebellion, and of the forces that sought to control both. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase it from history, to bury its truth. But the more Holmes spoke, the more I could see how important it was that we uncover what lay beneath the Ravenscar estate. "Holmes," I said, trying to piece together the situation. "If they went to such great lengths to suppress the vault, to create a haunting to scare away anyone who might stumble upon it, then what is it that they fear so much?" Holmes's eyes met mine, and I could see the sharpness in them. "The vault contains more than just treasures, Watson. It contains a key, something that could unravel the very power structure they've worked so hard to protect." Dr. Hartley nodded grimly. "And if the Ravenscar family was truly complicit in the Order of the Black Raven's activities, then the vault may hold evidence that could implicate high-ranking members of government and royalty. That's what they fear, what they cannot allow to be uncovered." I felt a deep unease settle in my stomach. But if we continue to investigate, we may very well be putting ourselves in great danger, won't we? Holmes turned to me, his expression unwavering. "Yes, Watson, but danger is the price of truth, and the truth in this case may very well be worth the risk." He picked up the ring again, turning it over slowly between his fingers, as though savoring the puzzle that was about to unfold. "We must make our next move with precision, Dr. Hartley. Watson and I will return to Ravenscar Hall tomorrow. There is still much to uncover, and much to fear." Dr. Hartley's gaze was intense as she regarded Holmes. "Then you must be careful. The Order of the Black Raven does not deal in small matters. Their reach is long, and their grip is tight." "We are aware of the risks," Holmes replied, his voice full of quiet determination. "But the greater danger lies in ignorance. We will not be deterred." As we prepared to leave Dr. Hartley's study, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were now part of a much larger game, one with stakes far higher than we could have imagined. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that the answers we sought were not just buried beneath Ravenscar Hall. They were buried beneath centuries of deceit, and only by peeling back those layers would we reveal the truth. The only question was, who would stop us from uncovering it, and how far they would go to keep us from doing so. The whispers of the tomb had only just begun. Chapter 5. Into the Shadows of Ravenscar. The following morning, the heavy clouds that had gathered overnight loomed over the small village of Ravenscar, casting a veil of gloom over the crumbling gravestones that dotted the overgrown cemetery. The wind was biting, and the trees swayed in the chill, their bare branches creaking like ancient bones protesting the cold. It was as though the very earth knew that something dark and hidden was stirring beneath it. Holmes and I stood at the edge of the graveyard, surveying the landscape, our breath visible in the air as the first faint light of dawn flickered through the mist. The Ravenscar Hall estate lay just beyond the cemetery, shrouded in secrecy and centuries of history. The Grand Manor, a decaying monument to forgotten wealth, stood with its imposing structure cloaked in ivy. It seemed to stand guard over the grounds, as though daring anyone to challenge its secrets. "I trust you are prepared, Watson?" Holmes asked, his voice steady but with a hint of excitement, an eagerness that only heightened in the face of the unknown. "I am," I replied, though I could not entirely suppress the unease that gnawed at me. But I cannot help but feel a sense of foreboding. This place, it feels as though it holds more than just the dead. Holmes gave a slight smile, but his gaze remained fixed on the mansion in the distance. "That is exactly what makes it intriguing, Watson. Every stone, every blade of grass here holds the weight of 1,000 secrets. We must uncover them, no matter the cost." With that, he turned and began to walk toward the cemetery gate, his long coat billowing behind him. I followed closely, my boots crunching over the frost-kissed ground, and we made our way toward the crypt that had so recently been the center of our investigation. As we reached the tomb, I noticed the thick black iron doors once more, which had been sealed for decades. They bore the symbol of the Ravenscar family, a raven, wings outstretched, encircling an ornate key, a sign of power and secrecy. The crypt itself was weathered, its stone facade cracked and marred by time, but it was undeniably imposing. It exuded a sense of both grandeur and menace. Holmes approached the doors, inspecting the rusted hinges with a trained eye. "These doors have been untouched for years, Watson," he said, his voice low, his fingers tracing the metalwork. "The seal is intact, but there is something not quite right about it." I could not suppress a shiver as I glanced at the tomb's entrance. "Do you think the haunting, these whispers, could have been a ruse to keep people away from the tomb?" Holmes nodded slowly. "Indeed. The voices, the movement, it is all theatrics designed to foster fear and superstition. But it is fear of something far more tangible than the supernatural that lies beneath it. Someone, or something, is being protected here." As Holmes continued his examination of the door, I turned my attention to the surrounding area. The cemetery, though old, seemed strangely well kept for a place left to the ravages of time. It was as though someone had recently been here, attending to the graves with an odd care. The overgrown ivy that clung to the stones appeared freshly trimmed, and the path leading to the crypt, though uneven, had been swept of fallen leaves. "Holmes," I said, a sudden suspicion taking root in my mind, "have you noticed this? The grounds are well maintained, almost as if someone is expecting visitors. Or is trying to conceal something." Holmes did not look up, but his lips curled in a knowing half-smile. "Precisely, Watson. Whoever is behind this ruse, this so-called haunting, has gone to great lengths to ensure that the crypt is left undisturbed, save for their own visits. They have allowed enough mystery to accumulate around the tomb to ensure that no one dares to come close without fear. And yet," I mused, "it is precisely that fear which may be their undoing." Holmes stood upright then, his eyes narrowing. "Indeed. The truth often comes when one least expects it, Watson. Let us not tarry. We must see what lies beneath." Without further ado, Holmes approached the entrance, where a series of intricate carvings adorned the stone archway above. He ran his fingers over the symbols, pausing for a moment on a particular section where a raven's wings flared outward, almost as though they were meant to hide something. "Ah!" Holmes whispered to himself. Just as I suspected. I stepped closer. "What is it, Holmes?" He looked up, his eyes gleaming with the thrill of discovery. "There is a mechanism here, an almost imperceptible one. This is not just any crypt. It is designed to keep something hidden. But if I am correct, there is a hidden entrance beneath this very arch. A trapdoor. I could scarcely believe it. The tomb, this family crypt which had seemed so permanent and sealed, was in fact a facade, built to conceal something far darker. The hidden entrance Holmes had uncovered promised to reveal whatever it was that had been buried here for generations. With a soft, calculated motion, Holmes pressed on a carved section of stone near the raven's wings. A faint click sounded, and the stone archway shifted slightly, revealing a narrow crack in the wall. Holmes bent down, his hands working quickly. Within moments, a small iron lever appeared, and he pulled it with a soft grunt. There was a long, groaning sound as the large stone door shifted, revealing an inner chamber that had been untouched by time, an underground passage leading deeper beneath the crypt. The air that wafted from within was cool, damp, and heavy with the scent of earth and stone. Holmes stood back, watching as I hesitated before taking the first step into the darkness below. "Are you ready, Watson?" Holmes asked, his voice low and almost teasing, as if daring me to follow him. I drew in a breath, my nerves prickling with both excitement and dread. "I suppose there's no turning back now," I replied. With that, Holmes stepped forward, and I followed him, our footsteps echoing in the stillness of the passage. The stone walls closed in around us, and the further we descended, the heavier the silence became. It felt as though we were intruding on a world that had been forgotten by all but the dead. Yet, somewhere in the recesses of my mind, I knew this was just the beginning. The answers we sought were hidden below the surface, in a place where neither time nor myth could erase them. We continued onward, our descent taking us deeper into the shadows of Ravenscar. But even as we pressed forward, a nagging thought clawed at the edges of my mind. What exactly had been buried here? And who, or what, would go to such lengths to keep it hidden? The tomb whispered in the dark, and I had a sinking feeling that the truth would not be kind. As we made our way deeper into the crypt, the temperature seemed to drop further. The damp, heavy air clung to our skin, and I could feel the weight of the earth pressing down around us. The torchlight flickered as if reluctant to illuminate the hidden depths we were now exploring. Holmes, ever the composed figure, moved with a quiet determination, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow and crevice. I, however, found myself uneasy, my senses heightened by the creeping sense of dread that seemed to grow stronger the further we ventured. The passage was narrow, and the stone walls bore the marks of age and neglect. The air was thick with the smell of earth, mildew, and the faintest hint of something metallic. My eyes adjusted to the dim light, but I could feel the oppressive silence surrounding us, broken only by the soft shuffle of our footsteps. "Holmes, I must admit, this place feels wrong," I muttered, my voice betraying the unease I felt. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he stopped for a moment, his fingers trailing along the wall, feeling the contours of the stone as if searching for something hidden. His brow furrowed slightly as he turned to face me, his expression unreadable but focused. "It is not a place of comfort, Watson," he said quietly, "but it is a place of purpose. We are not here merely to uncover a haunted tomb or solve the mystery of ghostly whispers." "What? This place has been deliberately constructed to conceal something of great importance, something the Ravenscar family clearly wanted kept hidden from prying eyes." I nodded, trying to ignore the chill that ran down my spine. "But why, Holmes? Why would they go to such lengths to create this charade?" Holmes gave a small, thoughtful smile, the light of his intellect sparking in his eyes. "That, my dear Watson, is precisely what we are here to discover. You see, this isn't just a matter of superstition. No, this is something far more calculated. Someone is trying to keep something secret, something that, if revealed, could have devastating consequences." We moved on, the passage becoming even narrower as we advanced. The walls were lined with old, weathered carvings, symbols that seemed to shift in the flickering light. Some were familiar, but many were foreign, their meaning lost to time. It was clear that whoever had built this crypt had not only sought to conceal their secrets, but to guard them with every possible measure. As we turned a corner, the passage opened up into a large chamber. The stone floor was slick with moisture, and the air here was thick, as if the very room itself had absorbed centuries of neglect. In the center of the chamber stood a stone altar, its surface cracked and covered in dust. Around it, the walls were lined with shelves that once held objects of great value, but now only dust and broken remnants remained. Holmes approached the altar cautiously, his keen eyes scanning every inch of the room. I followed closely, my curiosity piqued, but my apprehension growing with each step. It was in the far corner of the chamber that we saw something that made my blood run cold. A large, ornate tombstone, unlike the others we had seen in the cemetery above. It was carved from dark marble, its surface smooth and unnaturally polished. At its base was an inscription in Latin, which Holmes read aloud in a voice as cold as the tomb itself. "Here lies Lord Edmund Ravenscar, noble and true, whose secrets are sealed beneath stone and blood." Holmes's fingers lingered on the inscription as he considered the meaning of the words. "Lord Edmund Ravenscar," he murmured, his voice heavy with thought. "A nobleman whose name we have heard whispered in connection with the Ravenscar estate, but whose legacy has been obscured by fire. Yet here, in this hidden crypt, it seems there is more to be discovered." I stood beside him, my mind racing. So this is it then? The true Ravenscar tomb? The one that was thought to be destroyed in the fire all those years ago? Holmes gave a slow nod, his eyes narrowing. "Indeed. But what remains in this tomb is not merely a nobleman's body, Watson. No, there is something far more valuable beneath the stone, something that has been hidden away for generations, and someone has gone to great lengths to ensure it remains concealed." I could feel the weight of his words settle in the air around us, thick with implication. The mystery had deepened, and I knew that what lay beneath the tombstone of Lord Edmund Ravenscar was far more than a mere family secret. Holmes bent down to inspect the base of the tombstone, his fingers brushing the cold marble as he examined it carefully. After a few moments, he looked up, his eyes gleaming with realization. "It is as I suspected," he said, his voice tinged with excitement. "This is no ordinary tombstone. There is a mechanism here, hidden within the stone itself. The Ravenscar family was not only guarding their secrets, they were guarding something tangible, something that, if uncovered, could change everything." I felt a thrill of anticipation run through me as Holmes continued to work, his hands deftly tracing the intricate carvings that adorned the tombstone. With a final click, the stone gave way, revealing a narrow compartment beneath it. Inside, wrapped in layers of old cloth, was a small, intricately carved box. Holmes carefully lifted the box, his face etched with concentration. "This, Watson, is what we have been seeking. This is the key to the mystery, the reason behind the staged haunting, the whispers, the false fears. Someone is willing to go to extraordinary lengths to protect this." I could barely contain my excitement. "What is it, Holmes? What is inside?" Holmes slowly unwrapped the cloth, revealing the box in its entirety. It was small, no larger than a hand, and made of dark wood, its surface inlaid with golden symbols. As he pried open the delicate lid, I could see the glint of something within. Holmes's eyes widened slightly as he reached inside, pulling out an object that was almost too beautiful to comprehend. It was a gem. No, not just any gem, but a rare opal, its surface swirling with colors that shifted and changed with the light. It was mesmerizing, almost hypnotic, and I could not tear my gaze away from it. "The opal of Ravenscar," Holmes whispered, his voice thick with awe. A gemstone of unimaginable value, thought to have been lost in the fire all those years ago. But now, Watson, we find ourselves in possession of it. And with it, the answers to a mystery far darker than we ever imagined. I could feel the weight of the discovery settle upon me. The opal, so long thought lost, held the key to the Ravenscar family's secrets. But as Holmes studied it carefully, I couldn't help but wonder, who would go to such lengths to protect it? And what was the true purpose of this gemstone, buried beneath centuries of deception? The answers, I knew, were within our grasp. But they would not come easily. The shadows of Ravenscar were deep, and there were those who would stop at nothing to keep their secrets buried. Chapter 6. The Nobleman's Secret. The air in the crypt had grown colder as we moved further beneath the earth. The scent of mildew and old stone was thick in my nostrils, and a hush seemed to hang in the air, as if the very earth had swallowed all sound but our cautious footsteps. Holmes walked ahead of me, his lantern held high, casting elongated shadows on the damp walls. His every movement was measured, his attention focused, as though he expected the walls themselves to whisper secrets. "This, Watson," he said softly, "is a place where memory sleeps and deceit is carefully buried. Do you feel it?" I nodded, brushing the chill from my arms. "There is something unnatural about it, as though it were not the dead we disturb, but the living who wish to keep us away." We turned a final corner into a wide, vaulted chamber. Time had worn the once fine masonry into jagged shapes, and moss crept across the flagstones like green decay. At the far end of the room stood a raised platform, and upon it rested a stone sarcophagus. Unlike the crumbled remains we had passed in the outer tombs, this one was pristine, polished, cared for, and most notably, undisturbed. Holmes approached it slowly. He ran a gloved hand across the lid and paused at the inscription carved in flowing Latin script. "Edmund Ravenscar, who fell not by fire, but by fate." I frowned. But the historical account said he perished in the blaze that destroyed Ravenscar Hall. "Indeed," Holmes replied. "And yet, here lies his body, or so it would seem." With some effort, and aided by an old iron crank discovered nearby, we managed to slide the heavy lid aside. Inside was a coffin of dark oak, remarkably intact. Holmes leaned closer, inspecting the edges. He nodded. "Recently resealed. Watson, would you assist me?" I hesitated only a moment before moving to help. The coffin opened with a dull groan, revealing a body wrapped in thick layers of linen. Unlike the brittle, decayed corpses I had expected, this one appeared fresh, preserved. The linen was old but clean, and a faint scent of resin or embalming oils lingered in the air. Holmes withdrew a small penknife and carefully cut along the seam. As he pulled the wrappings back, we saw the face of a man, pale and gaunt, his skin still clinging to the bone. A noble countenance, even in death. A signet ring on one finger bore the crest of the Ravenscar family. "My God," I whispered. "Could it be?" "It is," Holmes said grimly. "Lord Edmund Ravenscar himself, and from the state of this preservation, I suspect he died not in fire, but quite some time after." "But the fire was nearly 30 years ago," Holmes nodded. "Which means this tomb was not only hidden, but his death deliberately concealed." He reached into the inner lining of the coffin and produced a tightly bound packet, letters, yellowed with age and tied with a faded blue ribbon. Holmes examined them quickly, flipping through the brittle pages. Correspondence between Edmund and a solicitor in London, details of land transfers, instructions to conceal certain deeds. His eyes narrowed. And here, a confession, he read aloud. They believe the fire consumed the estate. Let them. I have done what I must to ensure my descendants are protected from the disgrace of my dealings. The ledger is buried where none will look, beneath the chapel's foundation. Let none disturb it. Let the name Ravenscar remain unsoiled, even if I must vanish from the world to protect it. Holmes looked up at me, the lantern casting harsh shadows across his face. Watson, this is no simple haunting nor treasure hunt. This is a man who chose to erase himself from history. And now, someone has gone to great lengths to keep us from finding out why. My heart pounded. So the sounds in the crypt, the voices, the movement. A distraction, or a warning, Holmes replied. Someone is here, or was, determined to protect what Ravenscar buried. But I believe we are closer now to understanding the true nature of this affair. As we resealed the coffin and replaced the lid, Holmes turned back to the chamber's entrance. We must visit the chapel ruins by daylight. Watson, there is something still hidden, a ledger according to these writings, and I intend to find it. I cast a final glance at the sealed sarcophagus, a shiver creeping up my spine. We had disturbed a secret long buried, and in doing so, awakened forces, human, not spectral, that would not let us leave unchallenged. As we made our way back through the narrow passage, Holmes turned to me with a curious glint in his eye. Do you know what frightens men more than death, Watson? I shook my head. The truth, and we were about to unearth a great deal of it. The path back to the surface was treacherous, though familiar. Our descent had been marked by fascination and fear. Our return was filled with a heavier awareness, as though the shadows themselves now watched us. Holmes was silent for several minutes, his long limbs pacing ahead of me with characteristic urgency. I knew better than to disturb him, while his mind spun its delicate web of deductions. When we finally reached the surface and emerged from the crypt, the sun had begun to rise, casting a pale amber light across the overgrown cemetery. The long shadows of headstones stretched like the fingers of the dead across the frost-kissed grass. The groundskeeper, Mr. Ambrose Griggs, stood near the chapel ruins with a flask of tea in hand. He blinked at our sudden reappearance, clearly startled. "Merciful heavens!" he exclaimed. "You were down there all night?" Holmes brushed dust from his coat. "Indeed, Mr. Griggs, and we may well have stayed longer had the dead been more cooperative." Griggs frowned, puzzled, but Holmes turned to me with a meaningful glance. "Watson, you still carry that field spade from our initial survey of the grounds?" I produced the tool from the pack I had slung over my shoulder and followed Holmes as he strode toward the eastern corner of the ruined chapel. Vines and ivy curled around the collapsed stones, and the skeletal remains of a bell tower loomed above us like a finger pointing to heaven. Holmes moved with purpose to a section of half-buried flooring, where cracked flagstones formed a rough boundary. He knelt and tapped several of them with the handle of the spade, pausing when one emitted a hollow tone. "Here?" he murmured. I set to work. The soil beneath the flagstone was damp and stubborn, but after several minutes of vigorous digging, the blade struck something solid, wood, aged and splintered but clearly shaped. We pulled free a small chest, its iron latch rusted but intact. Holmes pried it open with his knife. Inside lay several neatly bundled ledgers, their covers scrawled with the Ravenscar crest and titles such as private accounts, correspondence, colonial holdings, and most curious of all, record of settlements, Calcutta Division. Holmes examined the latter, his brows knitting. These ledgers detail investments, land holdings, and payments to parties in India. His voice lowered. Substantial sums, in currencies not limited to sterling. I frowned. Why conceal all this so completely? Holmes looked up. Because, Watson, this is not merely a family's shame. It is the key to understanding the deception of the entire haunting. Someone has discovered these records, or at least learned of their existence, and has sought to prevent any further investigation by invoking superstition. But to what end? To ensure no one asks the right questions, the kind that follow money, not spirits. He stood, and I intend to follow that trail now. We returned the chest to our rooms at the Crown and Boar Inn under cover of dusk, and Holmes spent the better part of the evening transcribing key names and figures. He spoke little, though I could see the machinery of his mind turning furiously. At last, he looked up from the final page of the Calcutta Division ledger. "Watson," he said, "do you recall the name Cecil Belgrave?" I searched my memory. He was a colonial attaché, rumored to have gone missing 10 years ago while returning from India. Indeed, and here, Holmes tapped a line in the ledger, is an entry marked Belgrave, Darjeeling, discretionary funds. Large amounts, recurring. I leaned over to look. So Ravenscar was financing Belgrave? But for what? Holmes's mouth twisted into a rare expression of distaste. That, my dear Watson, is what we must discover. I dare say the whispers in the tomb were the least sinister sound we've yet to hear. We sat in silence, the only sound the rustle of paper and the quiet creak of the inn's ancient timbers. Holmes tapped the desk thoughtfully, eyes fixed on the fire. I suspect we are on the edge of something far greater than a family's buried shame. There is a pattern forming, one that reaches well beyond this graveyard. He stood and turned to me with that peculiar gleam in his eye, the one that always signaled the game was truly afoot. Tomorrow, Watson, we travel to London. I have a mind to visit the archives of the East India Company. I believe the truth, like our nobleman, was hidden beneath stone, but no longer. The train ride to London was one of quiet industry. Holmes sat opposite me in our compartment, so that surrounded by notes and ledgers taken from the hidden chest beneath the chapel ruins. The clouds over the countryside lent a dim gray cast to the morning, as though the weather itself shared in the mystery we pursued. Occasionally, Holmes would utter a clipped word or name, jot something down with his mechanical pencil, then lapse once more into that peculiar reverie I had come to associate with intense mental activity. "Watson," he said, some time after passing Guildford, "have you ever heard of the Calcutta Reclamation Committee?" I shook my head. It sounds like a colonial development enterprise. Just so, but one with remarkably opaque funding. Ravenscar's ledgers list multiple payments to this committee, more, in fact, than to any of his other colonial interests. There is something singular in that pattern. We arrived at Waterloo Station shortly after 10 o'clock and made directly for the East India House archives, now housed in the India Office Building along Whitehall. Holmes had sent a telegram ahead and was expected. The archivist, a neat, severe woman by the name of Miss Talbot, led us to a reading room where a trove of ledgers, correspondence, and registry books awaited. "What precisely are you seeking, Mr. Holmes?" she asked, her eyes sharp behind rimless spectacles. "The paper trail of a ghost, Miss Talbot." She raised an eyebrow but said nothing further. For several hours, we pored over brittle pages and parchment scrolls. Holmes worked with focused haste, tracing names and signatures, making swift cross-references between Ravenscar's private ledgers and official records. He paused frequently to compare handwriting, then scribbled notes in his small black notebook. "This is the crux of it, Watson," he said finally, laying out 3 slips of paper. "Here is Ravenscar's signature on a shipment of textiles. Here is the same name, identical hand, on a document transferring ownership of land to the Calcutta Reclamation Committee. And here," he pointed to a third document, older and more faded, "is the name Cecil Belgrave co-signed with Ravenscar on a mining charter near the Bhutan border." I leaned in. "A mining operation? In India?" Holmes nodded. "One never reported to the Crown, entirely off the books. And here, Watson, is where it becomes truly fascinating. This charter was filed 5 years after Belgrave was declared dead. Then he lived, or someone forged his name for financial purposes. Either possibility opens a chasm beneath our nobleman's legacy." We left the archives near dusk, stepping out into the rush of London life. The city's streets teemed with hansoms and drays, steam rising from grates like the breath of an old, tired dragon. Holmes paused before a tobacconist's to light his pipe, then turned to me with a rare glint in his eye. "We must visit Ravenscar House, Watson. There's more to that estate than decay and superstition. I suspect that somewhere among its ruined corridors or forgotten study lies the missing link, one that connects a fake haunting to a financial conspiracy of imperial proportions." I felt a chill despite my coat. "You believe this committee still exists?" "I believe," Holmes said, as we descended into the growing fog, "that the ghosts of empire do not rest easily. and some men will do anything to keep them buried. We had scarcely turned onto Whitehall when Holmes suddenly stiffened, his gaze fixed upon a man lingering just across the street, half obscured by a lamppost. He wore a charcoal coat and flat cap pulled low over his brow, and though he pretended interest in a newspaper, Holmes had already taken his measure. "We are not alone, Watson," he murmured. "A tale?" "Of the most amateur variety, but a tale nonetheless. Likely someone with only passing familiarity with the art of surveillance, perhaps a colonial agent or someone connected to the estate." "Should we confront him?" "No," Holmes replied, eyes narrowing. "We will let him follow. Give him a scrap or two to chew on. Let's visit a few antique bookshops in Covent Garden and allow him the pleasure of thinking us harmless." We did precisely that, leading our observer through a dizzying maze of side streets and curiosities. Holmes even made a minor purchase, a tattered volume on the legends of Bengal, and dropped a slip of paper inside, which he later explained bore a false address. When we finally returned to Baker Street, the light had gone from the sky, and the lamps cast a golden glow upon the pavement. Holmes stood before the hearth, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, smoke from his pipe curling up like incense from an altar of thought. "The tomb whispered to frighten away the living," he said softly. "But now the trail leads us to the quiet places where the empire hid its sins. There was silence for a time, save the ticking of the clock." "And if we unearth them, Holmes?" I asked. He did not smile. "Then we must be ready for what crawls from the grave." Before retiring for the evening, Holmes summoned Mrs. Hudson and requested a simple supper of cold meats and bread. As we ate, he reviewed the evidence laid out upon the sitting room table like a general consulting maps before a battle. Ravenscar's name surfaced again and again, connected to murky ventures and dubious characters. But it was the repetition of a lesser-known name, James Catterick, that arrested Holmes's attention. This man Catterick appears on shipping documents, land deeds, even a military contract concerning port refurbishments in Madras, he said, tapping one page with his index finger. But no such person is listed among colonial personnel. He may be an alias or a facilitator. Could he be the one funding the haunting to keep people away from the tomb? Very likely. Or orchestrating it on behalf of others who want the estate, and whatever is hidden beneath it, left undisturbed. We'll know more when we return. Holmes paused, gaze darkening. "But there's something more elusive, Watson. Something about the geometry of this scheme. The way the pieces interlock suggests not merely avarice, but strategy. Someone is trying to rewrite the past, and to do so, they must erase certain truths completely." Outside, the fog rolled thick along Baker Street, cloaking lamplight and footsteps alike. Inside, our little sitting room glowed warm with lamplight, the smell of tobacco and dust mingling in the air. Yet even there, with tea steeping and the fire crackling in the grate, I could not shake the impression that we were being watched, that the city itself was holding its breath. Tomorrow, we would return to Ravenscar. But tonight, in the heart of London, we prepared ourselves for whatever shadows lay in wait. Chapter 8. Return to Ravenscar House. The road to Ravenscar House was a muddy scar on the windswept moors, the kind that dragged wagon wheels into its bowels and made horses snort in frustration. The fog hung lower than it had days before, as if nature itself conspired to keep intruders at bay. Holmes, wrapped tightly in his Inverness cape, was silent for much of the journey, his pipe smoldering and the glow casting a strange light upon his sharp features. "I confess, Holmes," I said, shifting on the rough seat beside him in the hired trap, "the notion of returning to that place fills me with an unaccountable dread." "Quite natural, Watson. The human mind is notoriously stubborn in purging sensations of foreboding, but it is precisely that unease which those behind this affair have sought to instill. Fear, my dear fellow, is the very shield behind which deception hides." We arrived at dusk. The once proud Ravenscar house now stood like a relic from another age, its ivy-choked walls and broken pediments barely holding their shape. The estate was quiet, but not dormant. A flicker of light danced from the side wing, too precise, too artificial to be the play of moonlight. Holmes held up a hand. "The Whispering Tomb was but a ruse, Watson. Whatever is happening here, it is not specters that haunt these grounds." He led the way around the main house and through the overgrown garden until we reached the family crypt, partially concealed by hanging yew branches. The door, which the groundskeeper had sworn was sealed days prior, now hung slightly ajar. "They've returned," Holmes whispered. Inside, the air was thick with mildew and damp stone. We descended into the crypt with lanterns raised, our breath turning to mist before us. Footprints, distinct, recent, and uncareful, trailed in the thin layer of disturbed dust. At the far end of the tomb, behind the Saracen-carved effigy of Lord Ravenscar, a section of stone wall stood cracked at its edges. Holmes examined it closely and produced a small iron tool from his coat. With careful leverage, he pried free a panel, revealing a descending stair obscured by centuries of darkness. "This," he said, his eyes gleaming, "is the true mystery." We entered the hidden passage. The air grew colder, the silence more complete. After perhaps 50 paces, the tunnel widened into a subterranean chamber with crumbling brick walls and what looked like crates and broken furniture strewn across the floor. Holmes crouched and examined one of the crates. Smuggler's markings, though very old. But these, he gestured to wax-sealed glass vials tucked within a rotting crate, are quite recent. Laudanum, perhaps opium, enough to dose a small village. I bent low to examine the contents. "You think this is the true purpose behind the haunting?" "Yes. Someone has revived the old smuggler's tunnels to funnel illicit goods, perhaps even persons, under the guise of ghostly legend. And they've chosen the perfect staging ground, a noble house with a forgotten past and a tomb that no local dare approach." Suddenly, from the tunnel behind us came a footfall. Then another. We extinguished our lanterns. In the pitch black, Holmes leaned close. "Not a word, Watson. Let them pass us. Observe and remember." 2 figures entered the chamber carrying sacks. One lit a lantern with a match, revealing sharp features under a bowler hat. The second, a younger man in a threadbare coat, wore a nervous expression. "That's the last of it for tonight," the older man said in a low voice. "The cutter's sailing at dawn. We move the rest tomorrow." The younger one shifted. "Are you sure the villagers won't come nosing?" "They're terrified, lad. Talk of curses and ghostly voices. Even the old groundskeeper won't return." Holmes moved like a whisper. With speed born of precision, he lit a match, illuminating his face in the sudden glow. "I'm afraid your haunting has just been unmasked." The older man's eyes widened in horror. The younger bolted for the tunnel, but Holmes threw the match to the floor and tackled him by the knees. I sprang forward, revolver drawn, and blocked the exit. "Dr. John Watson," I said. "Former military surgeon. I've seen braver men run slower than you. Don't test me." Within minutes, both men were bound and seated beneath the ancient vaults. Holmes inspected their belongings, ledgers, half-burnt maps, and a coded inventory of shipments. "This," Holmes said, "goes deeper than Ravenscar. These men are but pawns. The true mastermind is yet beyond our reach, but this is a beginning." Outside, the wind had picked up, moaning over the graves like a chorus of the forgotten. Yet within that lonely tomb, the truth had been unearthed at last. The 2 captured men, one now sulking, the other seething, sat against the damp wall, their hands bound behind their backs with twine pulled from the very crates they had helped transport. Holmes knelt beside the ledgers with a pocket magnifying glass in one hand and his usual intensity behind his eyes. I stood near the entrance, revolver still raised for good measure, though neither prisoner looked keen to attempt another flight. "Curious," Holmes muttered, flipping the pages with care. "Note the symbols here, Watson. See these alternating triangles and stars beside certain shipment entries?" I peered over his shoulder. "Yes, but they seem to occur only every few pages." "Exactly. Patterns, my dear fellow. Patterns reveal secrets far more often than words do. This is a cipher. Crude, but effective. Each symbol corresponds to a location, a type of cargo, and possibly even a recipient." The older prisoner suddenly spat on the ground. "You won't make sense of that book. It was written for eyes you'll never find." Holmes arched an eyebrow. "Oh, on the contrary, I have already divined half its meaning, and the rest will come in due time. But let us turn our attention to your employer." The man set his jaw. "You've no proof I work for anyone." Holmes chuckled. "Your hands are the color of recent ink. Your boots stained not just with soil, but with powdered chalk, of the kind used to mark old stone passages. and the left cuff of your coat bears the faint, iridescent sheen of fish oil. You've made deliveries to ships, perhaps even helped load them under cover of night. You are not the architect of this ruse. You are the footman of its delivery. You can prove nothing. Holmes gave a small, satisfied nod. Perhaps not in this chamber, but the docks? The docks will speak for us. I stepped forward. And Scotland Yard will listen. Smuggling opium under the guise of graveyard phantoms may be clever, but it is still a hanging offense. Holmes rose and folded the ledger shut. Our work here is not done. These tunnels, these were used long before our present villains found them. I suspect this network of passages runs beyond Ravenscar House, perhaps connecting to the very foundations of the village. I looked around, trying to imagine centuries of shadowy figures and whispered trade. You think there are more entrances? Yes, likely disguised among crypts, collapsed wells, or abandoned root cellars. We'll need a proper survey, and perhaps a local historian if we can find one with a head not filled with superstition. We escorted the prisoners back up through the secret stair and into the moonlit fog outside. The wind hissed through the grass like whispers from the grave. The manor's silhouette loomed like a sentinel behind us as we made our way to the trap. The constables of the nearest station, one Sergeant Hale among them, met us with astonishment and a great many questions. By the time the prisoners had been loaded and the ledgers secured, the horizon had begun to gray with the earliest hints of dawn. As we rode back toward the inn, the sky breaking with pink behind the ruined estate, I turned to Holmes. Do you think this is the end of it? No, he said gravely. The end lies not in Ravenscar, but in London, and perhaps, just perhaps, in the drawing rooms of those who would use ancient tombs to bury modern crimes. Chapter 9. The Cipher in the Ledger. The first light of morning had barely touched the cobblestones of London when Holmes and I arrived back at Baker Street. The fog that had clung to Ravenscar House was now a mere memory, replaced by the familiar shroud of London's morning mist, which crept through the streets like an all-encompassing specter. Despite the early hour, Holmes wasted no time in stripping down the ledger that had now become the heart of our investigation. You see, Watson, he said, as he carefully spread the ledger across his desk, this is not merely a matter of illicit goods or smuggling. This cipher represents something much more insidious, something that may very well shake the foundations of British society. I peered over his shoulder, observing the cryptic symbols and sequences that filled the pages. Holmes had already made quick work of translating part of the cipher, and yet the rest remained a tangled web of seemingly arbitrary markings. But how can you be so certain, Holmes? I asked, though my voice carried the hint of awe that always accompanied his more cryptic pronouncements. It seems to me that these are nothing more than a means to track shipments and locations. The rest could easily be irrelevant. Holmes smiled, a thin, knowing grin. It is true that on the surface, these appear to be little more than codes for locating goods, opium, arms, and even some rarer commodities. But look more closely, Watson. These symbols are not random. They correspond to actual geographical locations, some of which are remote and scarcely known. This, he tapped a page with a gloved finger, is a map of influence, carefully hidden behind smuggling operations and ghost stories. But where do these locations lead? I see, I said slowly, the implications beginning to dawn. You think these shipments are meant for more than just a network of shady traders? These places, they could be connected to something else entirely? Precisely. Holmes was already lost in thought, as if the solution had not yet fully formed in his mind, but was tantalizingly close. Consider the nature of the locations themselves. Some of these places have been abandoned for years. Others were once sites of great political importance, ones tied to the colonies, to movements of rebellion, and to clandestine activities. But they were never forgotten, Watson. No, they were left as dormant embers, waiting for the right kindling. The sound of the gaslight flickering in the corner of the room seemed louder now, as if in response to the sudden weight of our conversation. I moved closer to the desk, leaning in to examine the cipher's more intriguing symbols. But you don't think this is just a criminal enterprise, do you? I asked, unable to mask my growing sense of unease. Holmes shot me a sharp glance. Criminal, yes, but only the beginning of a far deeper conspiracy. Watson. If the smuggling was the first layer, then I suspect that behind it all lies an organized effort to finance something much darker. A rebellion, perhaps, or even a movement meant to undermine the empire. I felt a knot twist in my stomach as Holmes's words sunk in. The notion that such a scheme could exist right under the nose of Scotland Yard seemed almost too absurd. But then again, we had already seen much more than we'd ever expected at Ravenscar. It wasn't beyond belief that this conspiracy would go all the way to the heart of British power. Holmes, how could we possibly begin to untangle this web? These ciphers could span continents. Holmes turned from the desk, his eyes distant, as if searching through the layers of time and possibility. There is one man who can help us, Watson. Someone who has connections in the farthest corners of the empire. Someone whose knowledge of the underworld in London could be the key to unlocking the true nature of these shipments. I raised an eyebrow. Who is this mysterious person? Jasper Quinlan, Holmes replied, his voice tinged with an unmistakable edge of disdain. A former associate of mine, though I've no great love for him. Quinlan is a master of shadows. He deals in information, in secrets, and in lies. If anyone knows who is behind this, it will be him. And how do you propose we get him to talk? Ah, Watson, I'm sure you recall our previous encounters with Quinlan. His loyalty lies not with the law, nor with any particular country, only with his own interests. It is his greed that will prove useful to us. Holmes smiled slightly, his expression now both confident and calculating. We shall offer him something that will compel him to speak, a piece of information even he cannot resist. That very afternoon, Holmes and I set out to meet Quinlan in the seedy, narrow alleyways of Whitechapel. The air was thick with the smell of soot and rotting refuse, a far cry from the stately, dignified rooms of the houses we were accustomed to. Yet this grimy underworld was the domain of men like Quinlan, those who trafficked in the shadows, using whispers and half-truths to manipulate the world above. We arrived at a dilapidated building near the docks, its windows barred and its door nearly as weathered as the streets themselves. Holmes gave a small knock, and after a few moments, the door creaked open, revealing the lean, hawk-like figure of Jasper Quinlan. He was a man of medium height, with a face as sharp as a razor, and eyes that seemed to flicker with some hidden fire. A permanent sneer twisted his lips, as if he had seen everything the world had to offer and found most of it lacking. Holmes, Quinlan said in a low, gravelly voice. I thought it might be you. What brings the great detective to my humble doorstep? Holmes stepped inside and I followed, cautious but resolute. I need your help, Quinlan, he said, his voice smooth and persuasive. There is a matter of great import, and I believe you are the only one who can provide the answers we seek. Quinlan raised an eyebrow. And what, pray tell, do I get in return for my valuable services? Holmes smiled, but it was a cold, calculating smile. Information, Quinlan, the sort that even you will find irresistible. Information about a matter I know you've been interested in for some time. Quinlan's eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer. You've piqued my interest, Holmes, but I'll warn you, I'm not in the business of charity. Holmes leaned forward, speaking in a voice that was almost a whisper. What do you know about the Raven's Call? Quinlan's expression faltered for a moment, his composure cracking ever so slightly. He recovered quickly, but the subtle twitch in his eyes did not go unnoticed. That's a name I haven't heard in a while, Quinlan said carefully. What are you suggesting, Holmes? I'm suggesting that it might be time for you to pay your debts, Quinlan, Holmes replied, and in return, I will ensure that certain loose ends are tied up for you. Consider it an exchange of favors. The air between them grew thick with tension as Quinlan weighed his options. Finally, he nodded, his lips curling into that same knowing grin. Very well, Holmes, he said. Let's talk. The door creaked shut behind us with a low groan, sealing us inside the musty confines of the room. The dim glow of a single flickering lantern cast long shadows on the cracked walls, and the air was thick with the scent of old tobacco and stale beer. The only furniture was a rickety table surrounded by mismatched chairs, all of which seemed as though they might collapse under the slightest pressure. Holmes took a seat at the table with an ease that seemed to belie the grimness of the situation, his eyes never leaving Quinlan's face. I stood by the door, my senses heightened by the thick atmosphere, feeling as though we were walking a tightrope. One misstep, and we could easily fall into a trap. Quinlan, however, appeared entirely at ease. He leaned back in his chair, crossing his legs and looking at Holmes as though they were old friends about to share an anecdote over a drink. "So, Holmes," Quinlan said, his voice dripping with mock friendliness, "the Raven's Call. You've gone to quite a lot of trouble for something that could just be a shadow in the mist. Are you sure this is the game you want to play?" Holmes did not flinch. "You know as well as I do that shadows can hide very real dangers, Quinlan. The Raven's Call is not a name one can dismiss lightly. It's tied to something much larger than a mere criminal syndicate. It's a movement, one with its tendrils reaching deep into the heart of Britain's empire." Quinlan's smirk faltered only slightly, his sharp eyes narrowing as he processed Holmes' words. The shift in his demeanor was subtle, but it was enough to send a ripple of understanding through me. "Ah, so you think the Raven's Call is not just a gang of lowlifes, but something bigger?" Quinlan asked, his voice cool but tinged with an edge of curiosity. "What's your angle, Holmes? What is it you think you've uncovered?" Holmes leaned forward, his fingers steepled in front of his face, his mind clearly churning through the possibilities. "I believe the Raven's Call has been orchestrating far more than petty crimes or smuggling rings. What they seek is power, power to undermine the very fabric of the empire. Their true goal is rebellion, and the cipher I've uncovered, Quinlan, is merely a small piece of that puzzle." Quinlan sat up, his eyes momentarily flashing with something akin to genuine interest. He hadn't expected Holmes to be so far ahead of the game. For a moment, it was as if the man in front of us, a man who had spent years slipping between cracks and secrets, was now caught in the very web he had crafted for others. "A rebellion?" Quinlan echoed, his voice lower now, more thoughtful. "And here I thought you were just a detective who solved mysteries for sport. You're talking about an insurrection, Holmes, and that's not something anyone takes lightly. Not even you." Holmes remained unwavering. "You know the extent of the influence the Raven's Call has, Quinlan. The cipher reveals locations, old estates, abandoned ports, secretive vaults, all of which are tied to noble families and imperial holdings, some of them thought lost to fire or neglect. What better way to orchestrate a rebellion than by controlling the flow of resources, weapons, and information?" Quinlan's lips twisted into something resembling a grin, though there was no humor in it. "And you think I know all the answers?" He chuckled darkly. "Holmes, if only it were that simple. These rebels, or whatever you call them, are not the only players in this game. You've uncovered the cipher, but it's the context that matters. It's who is playing it, and for whom, that makes all the difference." I had been following the exchange carefully, but it was only now that I began to understand the gravity of what Holmes had said. A rebellion. A conspiracy that stretched not just within London's criminal underworld, but through the very core of British society, threatening to ignite something that could tear the empire apart. "I'm not asking you to be the hero, Quinlan," Holmes continued, his voice hardening. "I'm asking you to be useful. You have ties, informants, connections, people who know how to make things disappear. You know more than you care to admit." The tension in the room was palpable. Quinlan's sharp eyes flicked towards the dim lantern light, almost as if considering the weight of Holmes' words. I knew then that something crucial was happening. The game was no longer just about solving a mystery. It had grown into something much larger, and Quinlan knew it. "Holmes, let me make one thing clear," Quinlan said, his voice now cold and deliberate. "The Raven's Call isn't something you want to dabble in. People who get too close, well, they tend to disappear. You and your friend here are walking into a world where the lines between friend and foe are blurred. Everyone has their price. What makes you think I'll play your game?" Holmes did not flinch at the threat. "Because, Quinlan, you always have. You may not want to be involved, but you already are. And the moment you stepped into this room, you made your choice. Either you help me now, or you'll find yourself on the opposite side. And when the storm hits, you'll be the first to feel the winds." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. I could feel Quinlan's sharp gaze boring into me, as though assessing not just Holmes, but me as well. The tension between the three of us felt almost tangible, like an unseen force waiting to explode. Finally, Quinlan leaned back in his chair and let out a long breath. "You really know how to twist a man's arm, Holmes? Fine, I'll tell you what I know. But understand this. Information is currency, and I've no love for your empire. I'm not in this for your cause. I'm in it for what's on the other side." Holmes smiled, the familiar glint of triumph in his eyes. "That is exactly what I need, Quinlan. A man who knows where his loyalty lies and where his profit is made." As Quinlan leaned forward and began to divulge what he knew, the air in the room seemed to grow colder, more foreboding. Every word he spoke was weighed with implications, each sentence revealing more about the secret machinations of those in the shadows. I could feel the tension building, a dark cloud that hung over the room, and I understood then that we were standing on the precipice of something far larger than we could comprehend. The cipher, the rebellion, the Raven's call, each piece of the puzzle was falling into place. But what would the final picture reveal? And more importantly, how far were we willing to go to uncover the truth? Chapter X, The Raven's Call Unveiled. The creaking of the wooden door echoed in the stillness of the small, dimly lit room. The murmur of Quinlan's voice faded momentarily as I looked to Holmes. His expression was unreadable, save for the spark of intensity that had returned to his eyes. He was piecing together something monumental, and I could see the eagerness in his manner, like a chess player while watching the final moves unfold. Quinlan had begun to speak in fragments at first, testing the waters as if unsure whether he should trust us fully. But with each passing word, it became clear that he had a great deal of knowledge about the people and events that were shaping this shadow war. Yet, even as he began to speak more freely, it was as if he were carefully guarding his own role in the larger conspiracy. His motives not entirely clear. "We're all players in a game, Holmes," Quinlan had said, his voice now steady and low. "But it's not just about money or power. It's about influence, about who controls the flow of history. The Raven's Call? They're not just some rebel faction you can dismiss. They want to change the course of history itself." Holmes nodded, his fingertips tapping on the edge of his chair as he leaned in. "Go on. Tell me everything." Quinlan's eyes flicked to the door as if to make sure no one was listening. Then, with a slight sigh, he began to speak, weaving together a tale that was as enigmatic as it was disturbing. "It all begins with the Earl of Wycliffe," Quinlan continued, his voice turning softer, more serious. "The Earl was not just any nobleman. He was a man of vast influence, connected to several powerful families both in Britain and in the colonies. His estate in the countryside was thought to be lost to fire, an accident, or so the official story went. But that was only a cover." Holmes leaned forward, his face a picture of intent curiosity. "The fire, then, was deliberate?" Quinlan's lips curled into a thin smile. "Deliberate and necessary. You see, the Earl had been a member of a secret society, the Raven's Call. He and a number of other aristocrats who had inherited vast estates were quietly financing dissent and rebellion in the colonies. Wycliffe's influence stretched across the empire, from India to Africa, even the Americas. The empire was built on wealth and power, but there were always those who believed it had to be dismantled, piece by piece." A cold shiver passed through me as Quinlan's words sunk in. I could almost feel the weight of the centuries-old conspiracy surrounding me, its tendrils weaving through history like some malevolent force. Holmes, ever the master of nuance, did not show any outward signs of emotion, though his calculating gaze was fixed on Quinlan. "So, the Earl faked his death?" Holmes asked, his voice sharp as ever. "And his estate was not destroyed?" Quinlan nodded slowly. "Exactly. Wycliffe didn't die in that fire. He disappeared. And with him, a great deal of wealth and influence. His secret was buried beneath the ruins of his estate. The Raven's Call wasn't just a criminal syndicate. It was an ideological movement, one determined to see Britain's imperial system crumble. They had men in high places, men with power to influence policy, to stoke rebellion where it would hurt the most." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. I could sense the quiet tension in the room. The room was charged with the feeling that we were on the precipice of something far larger than either of us could have imagined. "Holmes, I know this because I have worked for them," Quinlan continued. I've seen their plans, and I've been part of their schemes. But there's something you need to understand. The Raven's Call is not just a rebellion. It's a movement of ideologies and radical change. They've aligned themselves with some of the most dangerous elements in the empire. People who want to see Britain fall, whether through subversion, war, or economic collapse. The Earl was the linchpin, and he's not the only one. I exchanged a glance with Holmes. The pieces of this puzzle were coming together at a frightening pace. There was something in Quinlan's voice that conveyed deep conviction. He believed every word he was saying. But there was also something else, something far more sinister lurking beneath the surface of his confession. "Why are you telling me this now, Quinlan?" Holmes asked, his voice calm, but with a certain edge. "If you've been involved with them, why betray your own organization? What do you want from us?" Quinlan leaned back, his eyes narrowing as though weighing the consequences of his words. "Because, Holmes, it's all falling apart. The Raven's Call has lost its unity. Power struggles, betrayals, and internal feuds have fractured their once unified front, and I can see the writing on the wall. There are forces within the movement who are planning something far more dangerous than anything we've seen before. Something that will bring this empire to its knees." Holmes was silent for a moment, his mind clearly processing the torrent of information. Then, with the cold, analytical precision for which he was renowned, he asked, "And where is the Earl now? What happened to him after the fire?" Quinlan looked uncomfortable, his fingers twitching at his side as if he were preparing for a confrontation. "He's not dead, Holmes. He's alive, and he's been hiding in plain sight. But the truth of where he's been, that's something I can't reveal just yet, not without more evidence. You see, there are others who want him dead, and they'll stop at nothing to ensure that happens." There was a pause, thick with unspoken tension, before Holmes spoke again. If the Earl is still alive, then his estate, his wealth, must be somewhere. And if he's been hiding in plain sight, then it stands to reason that he's left clues, perhaps even to his allies, if not directly to the Raven's Call itself. What I need, Quinlan, is your help in locating him. And I need to know everything you know about his connections to the Raven's Call. Quinlan studied Holmes for a long moment, his gaze almost as penetrating as Holmes's own. "You've got guts, Holmes. I'll give you that," he muttered. "But you're playing with fire. The people who are hunting Wycliffe won't stop until they have him, and they won't stop at anything to make sure he's gone for good." Holmes met Quinlan's eyes without blinking. "I'm aware of the risks, but we don't have time to waste. The rebellion, the conspiracies, they're all in motion, and every hour we waste brings us one step closer to the chaos you've warned me about. We need to act." Quinlan exhaled slowly, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. "Fine. I'll help you, Holmes, but understand this. I'm doing this for myself as much as for you. I don't owe loyalty to the Raven's Call anymore, but I've made my own enemies, and I need to see this through." Holmes stood, offering Quinlan a steady, measured glance. "Then we have a deal." As we left the seedy tavern and made our way into the dark, silent streets of London, I couldn't help but feel the weight of what lay ahead. The world Quinlan had described, the secret societies, the rebellion, the dangerous individuals operating in the shadows, was a world I had only just begun to understand. But one thing was clear. We had stumbled upon something much larger than a mere theft or conspiracy. We were now on the precipice of a conflict that could shake the very foundations of the empire. And as always, it would be up to Holmes to uncover the truth. Chapter 12: The Lost Estate. The morning mist still clung to the cobbled streets of London as Holmes and I made our way toward the edge of the city. The sun was a dim, hazy disk behind the blanket of fog that stretched over the city. Despite the oppressive grayness of the day, there was an unusual sense of urgency to Holmes's movements. His step was brisk, his coat flaring behind him, and the light in his eyes told me that he was already a few steps ahead of me in his thinking. Quinlan's revelation had left us with many questions and few answers. The notion of the Earl of Wycliffe still being alive, and with ties to a secret society bent on dismantling the empire, was a theory that seemed both audacious and plausible. Holmes, ever the skeptic, was not willing to take Quinlan's words at face value, but he had accepted the core of Quinlan's story, that there was a web of deceit and rebellion in the highest echelons of society, and it all seemed to point toward Wycliffe's hidden estate. Holmes had suggested we start our investigation at the remnants of the Earl's former estate, or rather, what was left of it. If Quinlan was right, and the fire had not been as destructive as originally thought, then somewhere beneath the ashes and charred remains might lie a clue to the Earl's whereabouts, and perhaps the key to unraveling the conspiracy. We arrived at the estate, what was left of it, just as the first rays of sun pierced through the mist. The sprawling grounds were eerily quiet, with only the occasional rustle of wind in the trees breaking the silence. The remnants of the grand manor, a shadow of its former self, were barely visible through the overgrown underbrush and twisted iron gates. I could hardly believe that such a place had once been the seat of a noble family. The structure was little more than a skeleton now. Charred beams and collapsing stone walls marked the spot where the grand house had once stood. There was no doubt that it had once been a magnificent building, but the fire that had ravaged it had left little behind, but blackened remnants of its former glory. Still, I knew better than to think that was the whole story. Holmes' mind was already at work, parsing out details that I could not yet see. "It's more than what it seems," Holmes said, as we walked toward the remains of the old manor. His voice was quiet, but filled with the certainty I had come to recognize in him when he had solved the puzzle before anyone else had even noticed the pieces. "What do you mean?" I asked, glancing at the desolate landscape around us. "It looks as if the fire destroyed everything." Holmes stopped for a moment, his gaze scanning the estate, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. "The fire, Watson, was not intended to destroy the estate entirely. It was a cover-up, yes, but also something more." His lips curled slightly. "It's the very nature of cover-ups that reveal the most. When someone wishes to hide something valuable, they don't always destroy everything. Sometimes they leave just enough behind to fool the casual observer." I looked at the debris more closely. There were sections of stone still intact, though the building's framework was clearly gone. The fire had been destructive, but it had not been all-encompassing. Holmes had noticed something I had missed. Something was amiss here. "Look at the eastern wing," Holmes continued, pointing to what remained of the structure. "The stonework is newer than the rest of the ruins." "What? Do you see it?" I squinted into the distance, where the shattered skeleton of the manor stood against the sky. A section of stone in the eastern wing appeared to be fresher than the others, and the charred remnants surrounding it were far less severe. There was a subtle difference in the texture of the stone, as if the stone had been replaced after the fire. "Quite right," I said, starting to understand what he meant. "That part of the building didn't burn as thoroughly. It was spared." Holmes nodded. "Precisely. The fire didn't just destroy. It concealed. Someone went to great lengths to ensure that part of the building would remain intact. And I believe that is where we'll find our answers." We moved closer to the eastern wing, the ground uneven beneath our feet, the ruins creating an almost unnatural silence as we approached the newly discovered section. Holmes knelt, inspecting the stonework carefully. He ran his fingers across the smooth edges of a large, charred slab. As he did, he stopped, his face becoming a mask of concentration. "There's something here," he muttered under his breath, almost to himself. Then, louder, he added, "Watson, bring me that small spade from my bag. I need to examine something beneath this stone." I did as he asked, and when I returned with the tool, Holmes was already prying at a seam in the stone that seemed to be carefully hidden. He grunted with effort as he worked the spade into the crack, and after a few moments, the stone gave way, revealing a small, darkened hole beneath. "Well," I said, "I suppose this is where the real investigation begins." Holmes gave me a wry smile but didn't reply. Instead, he reached into the hole and pulled out a small, faded, leather-bound book. The book had clearly been hidden away for years, its cover scorched by the flames, yet its pages appeared intact. Holmes blew off the layer of soot that had accumulated on it and opened it to the first page. "What is it, Holmes?" I asked, eager for his explanation. "It's a ledger, Watson," Holmes said, his voice a mixture of excitement and triumph. "This is no ordinary ledger, though. It's a record of financial transactions that point directly to the Raven's call. I watched, astonished, as Holmes flipped through the pages. They were filled with intricate notations, names I recognized, important figures in society, business, and the colonies, but many of the entries were cryptic, written in shorthand or encoded symbols. "What's this?" I asked, pointing to a particular passage that seemed oddly out of place. A list of names followed by specific dates, each marked with a strange symbol resembling a crow. Holmes looked at the passage, his expression sharp and focused. "It appears to be a list of individuals who were involved in financing the movement, the Raven's Call. And these dates correspond to significant political events, rebellions, uprisings, economic shifts in the colonies. This ledger was being used to keep track of funding, supplies, and perhaps even contacts. The Earl of Wycliffe was clearly deeply involved." I looked at the ledger again, my mind spinning. It was clear that the conspiracy was far larger than I had originally believed. The Raven's Call was not merely a group of dissidents. It was a movement with an intricate and calculated plan to dismantle the empire from within. Holmes turned the last few pages, his brow furrowing as he read the final entries. "This is it, Watson," he said, his voice low. "The key to the next phase. The rest of the ledger was destroyed, likely to avoid detection. But this shows the movement's next steps." I peered over his shoulder as he read aloud the final, hastily scrawled message in the ledger. It was a directive, a command from the Earl himself. "Prepare for the uprising. The time is now." As the weight of Holmes's words settled in, I understood that we were no longer simply investigating a series of robberies or murders. We had uncovered the threads of an insidious plot, one that stretched far beyond the borders of England. The empire was in peril, and we were only beginning to understand the full extent of the conspiracy. The game had changed, and we would need every ounce of Holmes's intellect and every resource at our disposal to see this mystery through to its terrifying conclusion. Chapter 12. The Raven's Call. The eerie quiet of the estate was shattered only by the soft rustle of leaves in the wind as Holmes and I stood in the shadow of the ruined manor. The ledger, now securely wrapped in Holmes' ever-present leather case, was our only clue, and yet it was the only key we needed to unlock the rest of the mystery. The Raven's Call was no mere rumor or secretive society. It was a well-organized, dangerous conspiracy that had burrowed itself into the heart of the empire. After a few moments of quiet contemplation, Holmes stood up, his eyes glittering with a mixture of determination and unyielding focus. His mind, which had already been several steps ahead of mine in the investigation, was now piecing together new threads with lightning speed. I, ever his faithful companion, could only watch as he seemed to unravel the vast web of lies and manipulation. "Watson?" Holmes said, breaking the silence. "We are dealing with something far more insidious than I initially suspected. The Raven's Call is not merely an organization bent on rebellion. It is a network of financiers, influential aristocrats, and even military officials, all conspiring to weaken the empire from within, and the Earl of Wycliffe is their linchpin." I nodded, digesting the weight of his words. The ledger had shown that Wycliffe had been more than just a wealthy nobleman with a penchant for secretive dealings. He had been central to the funding of uprisings in the colonies, as well as a driving force behind the economic sabotage of key industries. But it was the final message in the ledger, written hastily and cryptically, that had caught our attention. The note that read, "Prepare for the uprising. The time is now." I turned to Holmes, my voice laden with apprehension. "Holmes, how far does this go? If the Earl is behind all of this, where does that leave us?" Holmes's gaze hardened, his mind racing as he formulated the next steps. "It means that our investigation is far from over. In fact, it is only just beginning. We have one final task, Watson, and it is one that may lead us straight to the heart of the conspiracy." He paused, turning toward the horizon, where the sun was beginning to break free from the haze of the morning fog. The estate, despite its ruin, still held an air of grandeur, as though it were a place frozen in time, waiting for the clock to tick once again. "What's the plan?" I asked, feeling a growing sense of urgency. "We need to trace the financial transactions," Holmes replied. "The ledger we have is only a fragment, but it is a crucial one. If we can follow the money, find where it was funneled to, we may be able to discover the Raven's call's true intentions. I nodded, my own mind already working through the logistics. And what of Wycliffe? Surely he is not just sitting idle while all of this unfolds. We must find him before he acts. Holmes' lips curled into a faint smile. Indeed, Watson, but we are not yet finished with the estate. There is something here that has been hidden for far too long, and I believe the final clue is buried beneath the ashes. We must investigate further. With that, we returned to the eastern wing, where the fire had left behind only faint traces of its once pristine stonework. Holmes, ever the meticulous observer, knelt by the stone once more, examining it with a precision that bordered on obsession. His fingers brushed over the ancient surface, tracing symbols and carvings that had once been all but obscured by soot and grime. "There's something here, Watson," Holmes muttered to himself. "Something more than what we've seen." I bent down to join him, my eyes scanning the area for anything that might stand out. It wasn't until I noticed a peculiar marking near the base of the stone, something that resembled an old family crest, that I understood what Holmes was referring to. "Look here," I said, pointing to the subtle engraving. "This crest, it's the Wycliffe family emblem, but there's something unusual about it." Holmes's eyes gleamed as he studied the marking. "Yes, it's been tampered with. The fire likely consumed most of the original markings, but this has been etched into the stone after the destruction. Someone wanted to make sure this symbol was preserved." "Why?" I asked. Holmes stood and surveyed the surroundings with a newfound intensity. "It could be a sign, Watson. A message hidden in plain sight. The Raven's call. Its presence is not confined to the financial transactions we've uncovered. It's right here, buried beneath centuries of history." He gestured toward the ruins of the manor, his gaze sweeping over the remnants of the family estate. "This is where the story begins, but it is also where it ends." I was about to ask what he meant when Holmes turned toward me with a spark of insight. "There's something beneath the ruins. A vault, perhaps. A hidden room where the true power of the Wycliffe estate lies. And I believe we have a map to it." Holmes's words were like a jolt of electricity running through my veins. He was right. The symbol, the hidden engraving, was a map of sorts, directing us to a place beneath the estate. But where? "The tomb," Holmes said, as if reading my thoughts. "The family tomb, Watson. It lies beneath the estate's chapel, where the Wycliffe ancestors are said to be buried." I looked at Holmes, understanding dawning in my mind. "You think the vault is there? In the tomb?" Holmes nodded, his expression now one of resolve. "Precisely. The fire was not meant to destroy it. It was meant to conceal it, to obscure the path that leads to the heart of the Wycliffe legacy." With that, we made our way toward the remnants of the estate's chapel, which stood a short distance away from the manor. The chapel, though battered and broken by time, still retained an air of solemnity and reverence. The faint outlines of stained glass windows, now shattered and warped by years of neglect, caught the early light in a kaleidoscope of muted colors. It was a place of death, of reverence, and, as we would soon discover, of secrets. Holmes led the way, his steps sure and confident as he approached the entrance. The heavy wooden doors creaked on their hinges as he pushed them open, revealing the dark interior of the chapel. The air was cool and musty, and the scent of old incense lingered in the stale atmosphere. Dust particles floated in the beams of light that filtered through the broken windows, adding an almost ethereal quality to the space. We approached the altar, which, like the rest of the chapel, had been marred by the ravages of fire and neglect. Holmes's eyes flicked over the worn stone, examining every detail with a practiced gaze. It wasn't until he reached the back of the chapel, near the entrance to the crypt, that he stopped. "There," he said, pointing to a large stone slab set into the floor. "This is it." The slab was massive, made of smooth, cold granite. It bore no markings, no inscriptions, just a plain, featureless surface. But as Holmes crouched to examine it more closely, he saw the faintest of grooves running along its edges, as though it had once been moved. "We're close now," Holmes said, his voice low. "This is the entrance to the vault." I stepped forward, eager to assist, but Holmes held up a hand. "No, Watson, this is delicate work. Let me do it." With that, Holmes went to work. His fingers moved swiftly, tracing the grooves and seams in the stone, before he found what he was looking for. a small lever hidden in the base of the slab. With a quiet click, the stone shifted, and a low rumble echoed through the chapel. "Here we go," Holmes murmured, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. As the stone slab slid open, revealing the dark depths of the crypt, I felt a shiver run down my spine. What lay ahead would uncover the true nature of the conspiracy that threatened the very heart of the Empire. Chapter 13. Beneath the Stones. The air in the crypt was thick with dust and centuries of neglect. As the heavy stone slab groaned into place behind us, sealing us in darkness, an uneasy silence settled over the chamber. Holmes, ever calm and collected, took a deep breath before striking a match and lighting a lantern. The flickering flame illuminated the walls of the crypt, casting long shadows that danced ominously along the stone. "Careful, Watson," Holmes murmured, as I took a tentative step forward, the weight of the moment pressing down on us both. We are entering into the very heart of a mystery that has been buried for generations. What we find here may very well change everything. I nodded, but my thoughts were clouded by the palpable sense of foreboding. The crypt itself appeared to be ancient, its walls etched with faint markings and symbols that I could not immediately recognize. Above us, the vaulted ceiling seemed to press closer with every step we took deeper into the crypt's bowels, and the dampness in the air grew heavier. As we moved further in, Holmes's lantern cast light upon a series of alcoves set into the walls, each one containing a sarcophagus. The names on the plaques were faded, but I could make out a few of the titles: Earl of Wycliffe, Lady Millicent Wycliffe, and others from the family lineage long believed to have been extinguished in the fire that had ravaged the estate, the fire that had destroyed all records of the Wycliffe legacy. Holmes knelt beside one of the sarcophagi, his fingers lightly tracing the edges of the stone. He peered closely at the faint carving of a raven on the side of the tomb. "This is it, Watson," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "This is the symbol. The raven's call is not just a name, but a mark, a lineage passed down through the Wycliffe family. The raven represents more than just the death of one chapter in their history. It is the herald of something far darker." I took a step forward, peering over his shoulder. "But what does it mean? Why did they choose this symbol?" Holmes's brow furrowed in thought, his sharp eyes scanning the rest of the crypt. "Symbols, Watson, are often our most reliable guides when it comes to uncovering hidden truths. The raven was once a sign of transformation, of change, a creature caught between life and death. It is no coincidence that the Wycliffe family adopted it as their emblem, for their wealth was built on change, deception, and a willingness to leave behind their old lives for something far more sinister." The air seemed to grow colder as Holmes's words echoed through the crypt. We continued deeper into the chamber, our footsteps echoing against the stone as if the very tombs themselves were listening to our every movement. It was then that we reached the far end of the crypt. Before us stood a large, imposing stone archway, covered in creeping ivy and layers of grime. The stone was different from the rest of the crypt, darker and smoother, as though it had been carved out by hands, other than those who had built the crypt itself. In the center of the arch, etched into the rock, was a symbol, the same raven we had seen on the sarcophagus. Holmes stared at the arch for a long moment, his lantern held high. Then, with a quick motion, he pressed his hand against the stone. There was a faint rumble, followed by the sound of gears grinding in the depths of the chamber. "The vault," Holmes whispered. The stone arch began to shift, revealing a narrow passageway that led further down into the earth. The air grew heavier, the smell of earth and age thickening with each step. Holmes's sharp eyes gleamed as he looked at me. "This is it, Watson," he said, his voice now full of certainty. "The true heart of the Wycliffe legacy lies beyond this passage. But we must tread carefully. What awaits us in the depths is far from certain, and I have no doubt that the raven's call will do anything to keep its secrets hidden." I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves. The narrow passageway seemed to stretch on forever, each step taking us further into the unknown. The lantern's light flickered as the walls closed in around us, and the oppressive darkness seemed to threaten to swallow us whole. As we descended, I began to notice strange markings on the walls, scratches and symbols that, to my untrained eye, seemed meaningless. But to Holmes, they were more than just scrawlings. They were clues, perhaps the very ones that had been left behind by the Wycliffe family to guide those who sought to uncover their legacy. "We're close, Watson," Holmes said, his voice low and focused. "The truth lies just ahead." At the bottom of the stairs, the passage opened into a small chamber. The walls were lined with shelves of books, their leather covers cracked and aged with time. There were maps, documents, and scrolls, evidence of the Wycliffe family's influence, their wealth, and their machinations. Yet in the center of the room, surrounded by a faint aura of mystery, was a large stone chest. Holmes moved towards it immediately, his steps quick and decisive. His fingers moved with a practiced precision as he examined the chest, noting the intricate carvings on its surface. They were symbols of power, of kingdoms long lost, of ancient rites and rituals. The raven, of course, was etched into the stone in several places, a constant reminder of the family's connection to this symbol of darkness. "This is it," Holmes murmured. "Inside this chest lies the key to the entire conspiracy." His hands moved quickly, unlocking the chest with ease, revealing its contents. But what lay inside was not what I had expected. It was not gold, nor jewels, nor documents of imperial treachery. Instead, it was a series of strange metallic devices, each one inscribed with symbols I had never seen before. Some were small, compact, and looked like mechanical inventions, while others were larger, more intricate, and looked like they belonged to a bygone era of alchemy or ancient technology. Holmes's fingers hovered over the devices as he carefully examined each one. His face was taut with concentration, his mind working overtime as he pieced together the puzzle before him. "These," he said slowly, his voice filled with awe, "are not just relics of a bygone age, Watson. They are part of something far greater. This is no mere conspiracy we've stumbled upon. These are the tools of a secret society, one that has existed for centuries and has influenced the fate of nations." I leaned in closer, my mind racing. "And the Wycliffe family was at the heart of it?" "Indeed," Holmes replied. "The Raven's Call was never just a rebellion. It was a mechanism of control, a way to manipulate the course of history itself. These devices are part of a larger plan, one that has been set in motion for generations." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What do we do now?" Holmes closed the chest with a decisive click and looked at me. "We follow the trail, Watson. The devices in this chest are the final pieces. We must take them to the authorities, expose the conspiracy, and prevent whatever it is they have planned." "But who can we trust?" I asked, my voice thick with uncertainty. "The reach of this society is far and wide. How do we know who is on our side?" Holmes's eyes hardened. "That, Watson, is the final test. The Raven's Call may have operated in the shadows for centuries, but we are no longer in the dark. The truth is now within our grasp, and we must ensure it is brought to light, no matter the cost." And so, with the devices secured, we made our way back through the crypt, our minds heavy with the knowledge of the vast conspiracy we had uncovered. The Raven's Call was no longer just a whisper in the dark. It was a powerful, malevolent force that had shaped the very course of history. But our work was far from over. The battle for the truth had only just begun. Chapter 14, The Conspiracy Unfolds. The winding streets of London appeared even more oppressive under the cloak of night. The gas lamps cast pale circles of light on the cobbled streets, and a chill hung in the air as if the city itself was holding its breath, waiting for something momentous to occur. Holmes and I moved with purpose through the fog, our footsteps muffled in the quiet, the weight of the devices we had uncovered in the crypt pressing heavily in our satchels. Holmes, as always, was unreadable, his face a mask of concentration. I, however, felt the gnawing sense of urgency deep within me. The chest we had found contained far more than mere relics. What we had stumbled upon were tools of a secret society, machinations that could shift the balance of power if wielded by the wrong hands. We had already made a pact. We would take these devices to the authorities and expose the truth. But something told me it would not be that simple. We were dealing with a group whose reach extended far beyond what we had uncovered in that dark crypt. The Raven's Call, as Holmes had aptly named it, was a conspiracy that had not only operated for centuries, but had subtly altered the course of history itself. As we reached Baker Street, Holmes paused, his hand resting on the door of our shared apartment. "We must be cautious now, Watson," he murmured, his voice tinged with the gravity of the situation. "Our every move will be watched. The Raven's call will stop at nothing to ensure that these devices never see the light of day." I nodded solemnly, glancing over my shoulder into the darkened street. Then where do we go from here? Who can we trust? Holmes's eyes narrowed, and he pulled me inside, closing the door behind us with a quiet click. "We trust no one, Watson. Not yet. First, we must learn what we are truly up against." I followed him into the study, where he immediately began to work, his hands moving swiftly as he arranged the strange devices on the table. Each piece seemed to hum with a latent energy, their metallic surfaces gleaming in the dim light of our oil lamps. Holmes's mind was already deep within the puzzle, his eyes scanning over the intricate symbols and markings. "Look here, Watson," Holmes said, his voice sharp with excitement. "These devices are not just mechanical in nature. They're crafted with a precision that speaks to a lost art, a kind of alchemical knowledge that was thought to have been lost centuries ago." I leaned closer, inspecting the devices with growing curiosity. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before. Delicate gears and levers intricately woven together, the surfaces inscribed with cryptic symbols that seemed to shift and change the closer I looked. "But what do they do, Holmes?" I asked. "How do they fit into the larger scheme of things?" Holmes's gaze was distant, his mind clearly working through the complexities of the puzzle. "That is the question we must answer. These devices are clearly not intended for simple use. They are part of a larger system, a mechanism that requires knowledge of forgotten sciences. I believe they may have been used to influence political events, to sway the outcomes of wars, or even to control key figures in power." A heavy silence fell between us as we both pondered his words. The implications of such a discovery were staggering. If Holmes's theory was correct, then these devices held the power to reshape the world itself. "We must find out who created these," Holmes continued, his voice low, "and we must uncover how they have been used. These people have operated in the shadows for far too long, and it is time to bring their hidden machinations to light." I watched him as he worked, his mind consumed with the task before him. There was no question in my mind that we had stumbled upon something far larger than a simple case of murder or theft. We were caught in the web of a conspiracy that stretched back centuries, its tendrils reaching into every corner of the world. Suddenly, Holmes stopped, his eyes alight with realization. "Watson, I believe I know where we must go next." I raised an eyebrow. "Where?" Holmes smiled, a rare glint of excitement in his eyes. "To the heart of the Raven's call. We must find the one man who holds the key to everything, Lord Edmund Wycliffe." The name struck me like a blow. Lord Wycliffe was the last known head of the Wycliffe family, the very family whose estate had burned to the ground along with all their possessions, including the family records. Yet now, it seemed, the fire had been more than just an accident. It had been a cover-up. "But how can we find him?" I asked, my voice filled with doubt. The Wycliffe family was thought to be lost. Their name faded into obscurity. How can he be involved in this? Holmes's eyes gleamed with a quiet confidence. "The fire was no accident, Watson. Lord Wycliffe faked his own death, and he has been pulling the strings from behind the scenes ever since. If we are to understand the full extent of the Raven's call, we must first confront him." We were silent for a moment, each of us grappling with the enormity of the situation. To confront Lord Edmund Wycliffe would mean stepping directly into the heart of the conspiracy. But it was clear to me that Holmes was right. There was no other choice. We had to take the risk. "Then we must go immediately," I said, my voice steady, though I felt the weight of uncertainty settling upon me. Holmes nodded, already moving to prepare. "We have no time to waste. Wycliffe has powerful allies, and they will not hesitate to stop us. We must act quickly and decisively." As we gathered our belongings and prepared to leave, a sudden thought struck me. "Holmes, do you think we can trust anyone? What if the authorities are compromised?" Holmes turned to face me, his expression serious. "We trust no one, Watson, not even the police. The Raven's call has infiltrated every level of society, and anyone could be a part of it. But there is one man we can trust, Inspector Lestrade." I frowned. "Lestrade? Are you sure?" Holmes smiled faintly. Lestrade may be an imperfect man, but his loyalty to justice is unwavering. We will need his help in bringing this to a close. And so, with the devices securely hidden, we set out into the night, the fate of our investigation hanging precariously in the balance. The Raven's Call had existed for centuries in the shadows, but we were determined to bring it into the light. The city of London seemed to close in around us as we left Baker Street. The fog clung to the streets in thick tendrils, obscuring even the dim glow of the gaslights, turning the familiar cityscape into a labyrinth of shifting shadows. Holmes led the way, his footsteps quick and purposeful. He had yet to share his precise thoughts on the next steps, but his face betrayed a growing urgency. "Holmes," I ventured as we walked, "do you think Lord Wycliffe is aware of our movements? Could he be watching us now?" Holmes glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the darkened alleyways and the occasional passerby. He was ever the master of observation, his senses alive to every nuance in our surroundings. "It's quite possible, Watson. If he's been operating in the shadows as I suspect, he has likely anticipated that someone would eventually connect the dots. The Raven's Call is not a group of amateurs, after all. They know how to conceal their true intentions." I felt a chill run through me. The weight of our task was becoming clearer with every step. We were hunting not just a man, but a network of individuals capable of manipulating the fate of nations from the safety of their concealed headquarters. To stop them, we had to disrupt their operation at its very core. As we turned a corner, we made our way towards Scotland Yard, where Holmes had arranged to meet with Inspector Lestrade. Although I had initially been skeptical about relying on the inspector's assistance, I had come to understand Holmes's reasoning. Lestrade, for all his shortcomings, had an honest heart. He was a man who genuinely wanted to see justice served, even if his methods were sometimes less than subtle. If anyone in the police force could be trusted to help us confront the shadowy figures behind this conspiracy, it would be Lestrade. We reached the yard just as the clock struck midnight. The fog had grown even thicker, and the building loomed in front of us like a fortress, its outline blurred by the mist. A faint glow from the inside leaked through the tall windows, casting elongated shadows across the cobblestones. Holmes pushed the door open with ease, as if he had done so countless times before. The familiar scent of ink, parchment, and freshly polished wood filled the air as we entered the station. A few officers, all hunched over their desks, looked up briefly before returning to their tasks. Holmes, without a word, led me straight to the back office where Inspector Lestrade was no doubt waiting for us. Lestrade, as expected, was already there. He sat behind his desk, a cluttered space strewn with papers, maps, and half-empty ink bottles. His face, though lined with weariness, was one of resolve. He looked up as we entered, his brow furrowing in concern. "Holmes, Watson, good to see you both," he said, rising from his seat. "I take it this means you've uncovered something significant?" Holmes, ever composed, nodded. "Indeed, Lestrade. We're dealing with an organization far more insidious than we originally anticipated. What we've discovered thus far points to an international conspiracy, one with far-reaching consequences." Lestrade's eyes widened slightly. "International, you say? I've always known there were shadowy dealings in this city, but this sounds far more dangerous." Holmes fixed Lestrade with a steady gaze. "It is. But it's not just confined to London. The Raven's Call, as I've come to call it, operates across borders. We believe they have manipulated key political events, influenced power dynamics, and ensured their own rise to power by any means necessary. The fire at the Wycliffe estate, the missing documents, it all points to a carefully orchestrated cover-up." I couldn't help but interrupt. But how does Lord Edmund Wycliffe fit into this? He was thought to be dead, consumed by the flames that destroyed his estate. How is it possible that he could be behind all of this? Holmes's lips curled into a small smile, a smile that was tinged with the bitter knowledge of the game we were playing. A man thought to be dead is often the perfect candidate for a mastermind, Watson. No one would look for him. No one would suspect his involvement. Lord Wycliffe faked his death, and it is from the shadows that he has pulled the strings of this entire conspiracy. Lestrade's expression darkened. "And you want me to help you catch him?" Holmes nodded. "Yes, but we need your resources, Lestrade. We need access to your files on the Wycliffe family and any recent activity that might suggest his involvement. The man has been living in hiding for years, but we've found a clue, a lead that we believe will lead us directly to him." Lestrade hesitated for a moment, his gaze flickering to the papers on his desk. "You understand that this isn't going to be easy. Wycliffe, or whoever is behind all of this, will stop at nothing to protect their secret. If they've been operating in the shadows this long, they won't hesitate to go to extremes to silence anyone who comes too close." Holmes's expression was unwavering. "We understand the risks, Lestrade, but it is imperative that we act swiftly. Time is not on our side." Lestrade sighed deeply, his fingers tapping the surface of his desk in thought. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he gave a reluctant nod. "All right, Holmes, you have my help. But we'll need to be careful. If we're going after Wycliffe, we need to have every angle covered. We can't afford any mistakes." "Of course," Holmes replied smoothly. "We'll need to move quickly, but with precision. We've already uncovered most of what we need, but I suspect that Wycliffe has set up numerous decoys to mislead us. We'll need to follow the trail carefully." Lestrade's face softened with a quiet resolve. "Then let's get started. I'll arrange the necessary documents and start coordinating with my men. We'll need to move in secrecy. I can't afford to have any leaks." With that, the three of us stood in the small, dimly lit room, the weight of our task hanging heavily in the air. The conspiracy that had ensnared London and perhaps the entire empire was closing in, and now we were its only hope of exposure. But even as I stood there with Holmes and Lestrade, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that we were merely pawns in a game far larger than any of us could yet comprehend. As we left Scotland Yard that night, the fog seemed to grow thicker, wrapping itself around us like a shroud. The uncertainty ahead was palpable, yet there was no turning back now. The web of deceit had been spun, and the only choice was to cut through it or be consumed by it. Chapter 5: The Shadow of the Past. The damp London fog lingered like a specter as we made our way to our next destination. Holmes, ever focused, walked with a purposeful stride. I could see the intensity in his eyes. The moment had arrived when everything we had uncovered thus far would either come together or fall apart. The stakes were higher than ever before. We had spent the better part of the day poring over the files Lestrade had obtained from Scotland Yard. Among the documents were old newspaper clippings, estate records, and letters from trusted allies of Lord Edmund Wycliffe that had been carefully hidden away in the vaults of the Yard. The more we dug, the more the pieces began to fit, and yet the larger puzzle remained tantalizingly out of reach. Holmes had found something peculiar in the estate records, an old ledger that detailed the significant financial losses of the Wycliffe family after the supposed fire that had destroyed their ancestral home. It mentioned an overseas investment in a company that seemed to operate in secrecy, one that was linked to certain political movements in India. This was the lead we were now following, and we were on our way to meet an informant who had long been in the shadowy world of foreign affairs. The mist had thickened, and we were now standing in front of a rather unremarkable building nestled between two narrow alleyways, almost hidden from sight. The building was old, with faded stonework and small curtained windows. The sign outside read R. Ashford & Co. Antiquities and Rare Manuscripts, but I knew from Holmes's cryptic words that it was not the place's declared purpose that mattered. It was what lay beneath its surface that was important. I turned to Holmes. "Are you certain this is the right place?" Holmes's gaze remained fixed on the building. "Nothing is ever quite as it seems, Watson. Ashford has been a discreet ally for years, though the less I know of his methods, the better. Trust me, the answers we seek lie within." Before I could respond, the door creaked open. A man stood in the doorway, a thin, wiry fellow with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. His face was pale, his features sharp and calculating. Holmes nodded, and the man ushered us inside without a word. The interior of the building was dimly lit by gas lamps. The scent of aged paper and leather hung in the air. The shelves were packed with ancient tomes, manuscripts, and curiosities, each one more obscure than the last. Ashford, if I was to judge by the manner of his greeting, was accustomed to dealing in the strange and the esoteric. He led us through the winding corridors to a small office at the back. Holmes, Ashford said with a curt nod. You've brought your companion, I see. This is Dr. Watson, Holmes introduced, my trusted friend and chronicler. We need to speak in private. Ashford closed the door behind us, his eyes shifting nervously as he gestured to a small table covered in papers. I trust this is about the Wycliffe affair? Holmes took a seat, his demeanor calm, but his eyes keen. Indeed, it is. We need the final piece, Ashford, the connection between Lord Wycliffe and the venture he financed. We know it involves the Raj, but the details remain elusive. Ashford hesitated before speaking, his voice dropping to a whisper. I wasn't always this quiet bookseller. I've been involved in matters of national importance for years, perhaps too many. Wycliffe's money, his influence, it's tied up in more than just an estate. It's an investment in the future of a movement, a rebellion, one that could very well change the course of the empire. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck prickle at his words. The weight of his confession hung heavy in the air. Holmes, ever composed, leaned forward. Tell us everything, Ashford. Every detail. The informant's eyes darted around, ensuring the door was shut tight. Wycliffe's fire, it wasn't an accident, Holmes. The estate was set alight on purpose. The documents that went missing from the manor weren't just estate papers. They were records of investments in companies that were covertly funneling money into insurgent movements in the colonies, specifically in India and China. I stood, my mind reeling. But why? Why would Wycliffe, a man of such status, risk everything to finance rebellion? Ashford's face grew more somber. Wycliffe wasn't just a nobleman. He was a visionary, one who believed that the empire was overstretched. He saw the colonies as a means to advance his own wealth and power, and when the British government failed to meet his demands, he began financing those who sought to break free from imperial control. It's a dangerous game, Holmes, a game that, if it were exposed, would shake the very foundation of British authority. Holmes sat back, his fingers steepled beneath his chin as he processed the information. I see. And these documents, the ones Wycliffe kept hidden, they're still in play, I take it? Ashford nodded gravely. Yes, a few of them were stolen from his manor before the fire. But there's more. More in the hands those who have used Wycliffe's wealth to further their own agendas. A group of operatives based in London is pulling the strings behind the scenes. They're not only involved in international politics, but in a series of heists designed to fund their cause. Do you know where they are? Holmes asked, his voice low. Ashford gave a bitter smile. I do. But if you want to get your hands on the final documents, you'll have to move quickly. They've set up shop in the East End, near the old docks. There's a warehouse there, at the corner of Ratcliffe Highway and Shadwell Basin. Holmes stood up suddenly, his face an unreadable mask. That's where we'll find them, then. Watson, we're heading for the East End. I trust you've kept your revolver on you? I nodded, feeling a surge of unease in my chest. I always do, Holmes. As we made our way out of Ashford's shop and back into the fog-filled night, the urgency of the situation weighed heavily on my mind. The East End, with its narrow alleys and darkened streets, was not a place I relished visiting. But it was there, among the shadows, that we would find the final clue. The shadowy organization that had been manipulating the Empire's fate was waiting for us, and time was quickly running out. Chapter 16. The Shadows Unveiled. The streets of the East End were a stark contrast to the polished avenues of central London. The fog had thickened to a choking haze, obscuring the narrow alleyways and casting long, eerie shadows from the flickering gas lamps. A grim sense of foreboding hung in the air as Holmes, Watson, and I made our way towards the heart of the mystery. The old warehouses of Ratcliffe Highway and Shadwell Basin. Holmes had been unusually silent, his mind clearly focused on the task ahead. We had gathered enough intelligence to know that we were about to walk straight into the lair of those who had been manipulating events from the shadows. The clock was ticking, and the consequences of failure were too great to contemplate. Holmes, I ventured quietly, do you think we will be able to stop them in time? Holmes's gaze remained fixed ahead, his face as inscrutable as ever. We have no choice but to try, Watson. They have crossed too many lines. And this game they're playing threatens to unravel the very fabric of the Empire. I nodded, though a part of me wondered what we were truly walking into. From the information we had gathered, it was clear that this operation was far more than just a series of heists. It was a calculated effort to fund a rebellion, one that could not only destabilize the empire's colonial holdings, but also fracture the delicate balance of power within Britain itself. The East End was alive with its own kind of energy, gritty, chaotic, and filled with a tension that crackled in the air. We reached the warehouse district just as the evening's darkness descended fully, the industrial buildings looming like silent sentinels, their facades weathered by years of neglect. Holmes stopped in front of a large, abandoned warehouse near the corner of Ratcliffe Highway and Shadwell Basin. The building seemed unremarkable at first glance, but Holmes's sharp eyes scanned the area, taking in every detail with precision. There were no guards posted outside, no obvious signs of movement. Yet, Holmes's instincts told him that the enemy was very near. "We move in quietly," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We cannot afford to alert them until we know exactly what we're dealing with." I nodded, adjusting my own revolver beneath my coat. I had always been uncomfortable with the idea of violence, but I knew that tonight might be different. The stakes had never been higher. As we approached the entrance, Holmes motioned for us to stop. He crouched down, examining the ground near the door. A small, inconspicuous mark caught his eye, and with a quiet curse, he gestured for me to step back. "They've been expecting us," he murmured. "The door has been rigged with a trap." I stepped away in haste, my heart racing. I could feel the weight of the situation pressing in on me, but Holmes's calm demeanor steadied my nerves. "What should we do?" I asked. "We find another way in," he replied, his voice cool and determined. "Follow my lead." Holmes led us around the back of the warehouse, where a narrow alleyway ran parallel to the building. The air smelled faintly of salt water and decay, a sign of the proximity to the docks. As we crept along, the dim light from the distant lampposts barely illuminated our path. Holmes stopped at the back door of the warehouse, a small, weathered entryway that appeared to be little more than a service entrance. He tested the handle, then paused. "It's unlocked. A mistake? Or a trap?" He didn't wait for an answer, pushing the door open slowly. The interior of the warehouse was vast, the cavernous space filled with crates, barrels, and remnants of old shipping materials. The faint sound of voices drifted through the gloom, followed by the occasional clang of metal against wood. We slipped inside, our footsteps muffled by the thick dust that coated the floor. Holmes led the way, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow, as though he could sense the presence of danger lurking just out of view. I followed closely behind, my own senses heightened, every nerve on edge. The feeling of being watched was palpable, and it seemed that the deeper we ventured into the warehouse, the stronger the sensation became. "Do you hear that?" Holmes whispered. I strained my ears, trying to discern the source of the sound. It was a low murmur, like a conversation, but the voices were too faint to make out any words. We continued to move forward, taking cover behind stacks of crates and barrels as we made our way deeper into the heart of the warehouse. As we rounded a corner, the faint voices grew louder, and the outline of several figures became visible in the dim light. They were gathered around a table, their attention focused on a series of papers and maps that lay scattered before them. I could make out a few faces, most of them hardened men, dressed in nondescript clothing, with the exception of one man who stood at the center, tall, with sharp features and a calculating gaze. His eyes met mine for a brief moment, and I could feel the weight of his scrutiny. "Stay hidden," Holmes whispered urgently, his grip tightening on his own revolver. "This is our moment." I nodded, heart pounding in my chest. Holmes moved with a predator's grace, his every movement calculated and precise. He drew closer, inching along the edge of the room until he was within earshot of the group. As he neared, he stopped, listening intently. The man at the center of the table spoke, his voice cold and deliberate. "We've secured the next shipment. The funds are in place. Soon, the rebellion will be unstoppable." Holmes's eyes widened, and he turned to me, his expression darkening. "It's worse than we thought, Watson. They have already laid the groundwork for their rebellion. It's no longer just about money. It's about control." I felt a chill run down my spine. "And Wycliffe? What does he have to do with this?" The man at the table spoke again. Wycliffe's funds were always a means to an end. He was a necessary player, but not the endgame. Once the shipments arrive, we'll be ready. The first phase begins tomorrow. Holmes's hand moved to his coat pocket, and he pulled out a small concealed mirror. With great care, he held it at an angle to reflect the light from the lamps, allowing us to see the entire group. I could make out several men, each with a distinct aura of authority, but it was the man at the center who held my attention. "That's the leader," Holmes muttered. "I'll need to confront him directly." With a single swift motion, Holmes rose from his hiding spot and walked boldly toward the group. I had no time to react before he was within earshot of the conspirators. "Gentlemen," Holmes's voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "I trust I'm not interrupting a private meeting?" The room fell silent as every head turned toward him. The leader, a man whose name I still did not know, stared at Holmes with an expression of mild amusement, as if he were in the presence of an old acquaintance. "I must admit," Holmes continued, his tone cold and confident, "I didn't expect to find such a gathering in this warehouse. But then again, I never expect the ordinary in my line of work." The leader's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, and then his eyes narrowed. "Holmes," he said, his voice laced with contempt, "I wondered when you would show up." "I'm afraid your plans have come to an end," Holmes said, his eyes flashing with determination. "You may have eluded justice for now, but your conspiracy is over. I suggest you surrender." The men around the table rose, their hands instinctively going to their weapons. But Holmes was quicker. In the span of a heartbeat, the air was filled with the sharp crack of gunfire. In the ensuing chaos, I could see Holmes take control of the situation with a calmness that belied the tension in the room. The men who had once plotted rebellion now found themselves outmatched by the indomitable Sherlock Holmes. As the dust settled, the leader of the group slumped to the ground, his chest heaving with a final, defeated sigh. Holmes's revolver remained steady in his hand, but there was no triumph in his expression, only the quiet satisfaction of justice served. "We've done it, Watson," Holmes said quietly, holstering his revolver. "The conspiracy is broken. The rebellion will never come to pass." I stood, still reeling from the confrontation. The weight of what had just transpired hung heavily on my shoulders, but there was no time for reflection. We had work to do. Holmes turned toward me, his face as inscrutable as ever. "Let's go, Watson. There are still questions that need answering, and I suspect this is far from the last of our troubles." As we made our way out of the warehouse, the fog seemed less oppressive, as though the shadow of the conspiracy had been lifted from the city. The rebellion that had once threatened the Empire was no more, but the mysteries that remained would undoubtedly keep Holmes and I busy for years to come. Epilogue. Several months had passed since the fall of the conspiracy. The city had returned to its rhythm, the ever-present fog of London, now no more than an occasional cloak over the streets. The rebellion had been quelled, and the mastermind who had orchestrated it all lay in a grave far removed from the chaos he sought to create. Yet, for Sherlock Holmes, peace was but a fleeting moment. The world continued to turn with its endless mysteries, its tangled webs of deceit, and its dark corners that only he seemed capable of illuminating. One crisp morning, I found myself once again seated across from him in our Baker Street chambers, the same comforting clutter of books, papers, and tobacco smoke filling the room. Holmes, ever the enigmatic figure, was hunched over his violin, his bow gliding in slow, deliberate strokes, as if unraveling the threads of a case long past. "You seem lost in thought, Holmes," I remarked, watching him with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Is there something troubling you?" Holmes paused, setting down the violin, his eyes narrowing slightly as if he had been waiting for the right moment to speak. "Not troubled, Watson," he replied, his voice calm but edged with an unspoken intensity. "Simply reflecting. You see, we may have prevented one rebellion, but the world, as always, is full of those who would seek to disrupt the order." I nodded, understanding the weight of his words. Holmes was never one to rest on his laurels, always looking beyond the immediate case to the greater mysteries yet to be solved. "Do you ever think," I ventured, "that we might one day run out of mysteries?" Holmes raised an eyebrow, a faint smirk curling at the corner of his mouth. "You know as well as I, Watson, that the world is an endless puzzle. It is not the lack of mysteries that would bring an end to our work. It is the lack of curiosity. And fortunately for us, that is something neither you nor I are in danger of losing. With that, he picked up his violin once more, and the soft, melancholic strains of the music filled the room, a reminder that in Holmes's world, there was always another case to solve, another secret to uncover, and a new adventure waiting just around the corner. As the music echoed through the chambers, I leaned back in my chair, content in the knowledge that the greatest mysteries were not always those that were solved, but those that would continue to unfold for as long as we sought the truth. And so, the game continued, ever elusive, ever fascinating, and, for Sherlock Holmes, forever captivating. Thank you so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed the story. Don't forget to leave a comment letting us know which story you'd like to hear next and where you're tuning in from. We love hearing from our detective fans around the world. See you in the next adventure.